He laughed at her in front of 12 executives. Not a dismissive chuckle. Not an awkward smile to soften a disagreement. A full, open laugh, the kind that fills a room and makes everyone else join in just to belong to the moment. Adrian Vale looked at his wife across that long dinner table, surrounded by men who needed him to feel powerful. And he said the 7 words that would cost him everything. You've been away from business too long. Simone didn't cry, didn't argue, didn't reach for her wine glass to steady her hands. She simply went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with surrender. And 3 days later, Adrian stood on his penthouse balcony, watching a 300-foot luxury yacht emerge from the fog, sent specifically for the woman he had just humiliated in front of an entire room. If that had been you sitting across that table, would you have stayed as long as she did? Before we go further, if stories like this hit somewhere real for you, do us a favor and subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button. And drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from, because we genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The evening started the way most of Adrian Vale's evenings started, with everything arranged exactly the way he preferred. The private dining room at the Meridian Club occupied the entire 42nd floor of the building he had purchased 6 years earlier, not because he needed the space, but because owning the building where he held his most important dinners felt like the right kind of statement. The table seated 14. The lighting was set low enough to be flattering, but bright enough to read expressions. The chef had been briefed 2 days in advance. The wine was chosen by someone whose only job was choosing wine. 12 of the most significant investors and potential partners in Vale Maritime's coastal expansion plan sat around that table. Simone sat at Adrian's right. She had spent the afternoon reviewing the acquisition documents he'd left on the kitchen island, not because he'd asked her to, but because she still did things like that. Old habit. Old love dressed in practical clothing. She read through 340 pages of due diligence materials while he took calls in his office, and when she found what she found, she wrote 4 paragraphs of notes in a small leather notebook she kept in her coat pocket. She waited until the appetizers were cleared before she brought it up. It was not the ideal moment, she understood that. 12 people at the table, wine already opened, conversation moving warmly through the room. She understood the optics. But there was a financing close scheduled for 10 days out, and the number she'd found buried in the target company's debt disclosure wasn't something that could wait for a quieter moment that might not come. She leaned slightly toward Adrian and kept her voice low. The subordinated debt on the Harmon Marina network, she said. The restructuring covenant in Section 14. There's a cross-default trigger tied to 3 of the subsidiary leases. If any one of those properties misses a rent payment, it accelerates the entire debt stack. That's not disclosed in the summary. Adrian was mid-sentence with the man across from him. He glanced at Simone. She watched his face, the slight tightening around his eyes. The almost invisible tension in his jaw that she had learned over 7 years meant he was recalibrating how to handle a disruption without appearing disrupted. Simone. His voice was patient in the way that a teacher is patient with a student who has raised their hand at an inconvenient time. I'm not trying to derail anything, she said. But if that trigger fires, sweetheart. The word was gentle. It was also a lid placed firmly over a container. The team has been through those documents for 8 weeks. I know, but Section 14, Simone. He said her name a 3rd time. Something in the room shifted. The conversations nearest to them softened. A few heads turned. The attorneys have vetted every page of this deal. Attorneys vet for liability. This is a structural. You've been away from business too long. He laughed as he said it. Not cruelly. That was almost the worst part. He laughed the way someone laughs at a charming but misguided observation, fond and dismissive in equal measure. A few people at the table smiled reflexively, following his lead the way people at dinner tables always follow the lead of whoever owns the room. Simone felt the heat rise from her sternum to her face. She did not move. She had learned that too, how to hold herself absolutely still when the thing she wanted to do was stand up and walk out. She picked up her water glass. She set it down. She said nothing else for the rest of the meal. Afterward, in the car on the way home, Adrian rested his hand on hers and told her the dinner had gone beautifully. He said it like the earlier moment had already been folded up and placed somewhere he didn't intend to revisit. He talked about the financing timeline, about a call he needed to make before Friday, about whether they should take a long weekend before the close date. Simone watched the city pass through the window. She thought about Section 14. She thought about how long she had been watching her own thoughts pass through windows. 3 days later, she packed a small suitcase, not the large one, not the designer luggage Adrian had bought her for the trip to Copenhagen the previous fall. The small one she'd owned before they married, a soft-sided carry-on with a broken wheel she'd never fixed because she'd never needed to fix it, because for 7 years she had not gone anywhere alone. Adrian came home to find her standing in the middle of their bedroom, with the suitcase on the bed and her coat already on. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the suitcase. He looked at her. He looked at the coat. "Where are you going?" Simone turned and looked at him, not angrily. That was what surprised him. He'd braced for anger, had already begun constructing the counter-argument in his head, had already decided that whatever she was upset about could be addressed if she would just explain it clearly and without emotion. But there was no anger on her face. There was something much harder to argue with: exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of someone who has spent a long time trying to be seen and has finally quietly decided to stop trying. Simone. He walked into the room. "If this is about the dinner, it isn't about the dinner. Because I've told you, the team has that acquisition completely." "Adrian." She said his name once, just once. He stopped. She reached into her coat pocket and took out her wedding ring. She set it on the small table beside his untouched evening whiskey. He stared at it. "You're being dramatic," he said. But his voice had changed. Something in it had gone careful. "I kept waiting," she said, "for you to remember who I was. I know exactly who you are. You know who you decided I was." She picked up the suitcase. "That's not the same thing." Adrian moved between her and the door, not aggressively but deliberately. The way he moved when he wanted to control the geography of a negotiation. "Talk to me. Whatever I did at the dinner, I apologize." "I shouldn't have said it that way." "That way," Simone repeated. "The wording, you think it was the wording." He reached for her arm. She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. She just looked at his hand on her arm, the way you look at something that used to mean more than it currently does. "I'm not leaving to punish you," she said. "I'm leaving because I finally remembered that I exist when you're not in the room." She moved around him. He followed her to the balcony, not sure what he intended to do once he caught up, whether he planned to apologize more specifically or argue more directly, or simply stand close enough that leaving would feel harder. He wasn't sure. He only knew that Simone moving toward a door felt fundamentally wrong in a way his body registered before his mind could process it. He stepped onto the balcony. The rain was steady and cold. The marina below reflected 100 broken lights. Fog sat heavy over the water, the kind that swallowed distances and made the harbor feel like the edge of something unknowable. He expected to see her flag down a car on the street below. He expected the ordinary logistical awkwardness of a separation, the cab, the suitcase, the moment of mundane mechanics that would make the whole thing feel manageable. Something to be addressed and corrected. Instead, the fog moved. Something enormous came through it. It happened slowly enough that his brain didn't immediately classify it, just a mass of light and steel resolving out of the darkness, growing larger, taking shape. Then the shape became undeniable. A yacht. Not a large yacht. A massive one. 300 feet of black hull and silver superstructure, its running lights strung along its length like the outline of a skyline, moving through the fog with the unhurried certainty of something that has never needed to worry about what was in its way. Adrian gripped the balcony railing. He knew this vessel. Everyone in international maritime knew this vessel. The Sovereign Dawn. Caspian Ro's yacht. Caspian Ro, who had built Ro Oceanic Group from a single coastal car investment fund into one of the most quietly powerful private maritime organizations on the planet. A man who appeared on no boards he didn't control, gave no interviews he didn't orchestrate, and moved his money through the industry like water, moving through rock invisibly, inevitably, reshaping everything it touched. His flagship yacht did not appear in Port Meridian's private marina. That was not the kind of thing that happened. Adrian watched it happen anyway. The Sovereign Dawn slowed. It turned with improbable precision for something its size. It approached the private dock below his building with the confidence of a vessel that had docked there before, or had been told exactly where to go by someone who had. Uniformed crew descended the gangway. A captain appeared at the rail, umbrella already open. Not for himself, for Simone. She was already at the dock. She had known exactly how long to take saying goodbye. She had timed it to the minute. Adrian watched the captain open the umbrella over his wife's head. He watched the crew take her suitcase, the small one, with the broken wheel, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He watched Simone step toward the gangway, and he heard it, from 3 stories above, carried up through the rain-wet air with terrible clarity. "Welcome back, Ms. Mercer. Welcome back. Not welcome aboard. Not good evening. Welcome back." As if she had been here before. As if this was a return rather than a departure. Simone walked up the gangway and disappeared into the interior of the Sovereign Dawn without looking up. The crew retracted the gangway. The lines were released. The yacht began to move. Adrian stood on the balcony in the rain and watched 300 feet of someone else's certainty carry his wife out of Port Meridian's harbor and into the fog. His whiskey was still untouched on the table inside. Her ring was beside it. He didn't go in for a long time. He didn't sleep. By 3 in the morning, he was at his desk with his laptop open. Doing what he did with every problem that threatened to exceed his control, he started pulling information. He searched Caspian Row. He searched the Sovereign Dawn's port records. He searched Simone's name in contexts he had never thought to search before, because for 7 years he had known exactly who his wife was and had never considered that his certainty might be the problem. The first thing that stopped him was a Row Oceanic annual report from 9 years ago. There was a section on their private investment division. A brief paragraph acknowledging the work of a newly developed proprietary coastal assessment model that had identified several high-value, underdeveloped maritime assets along the Pacific coast. The model was attributed to a junior analyst named S. Mercer. Adrian read it twice. He typed the name into a separate search. What came back was not what he expected. Simone Mercer, not Simone Vale. Her name before the marriage had published a 70-page research paper at 25 called Reclaiming the Coastal Edge: Investment Models for Overlooked Maritime Infrastructure. It had been presented at an international maritime investment conference in Vancouver and subsequently distributed internally at 3 major investment firms. He opened the paper. He read the first 20 pages before he realized his coffee had gone cold. The methodology was precise, counterintuitive in places, and fundamentally sound in a way that would have been remarkable from a seasoned analyst. From a 25-year-old, it was something else entirely. He found a profile piece from a financial journal dated 8 years ago. A paragraph near the end mentioned that Simone Mercer had recently departed Row Oceanic's coastal investment division to pursue other endeavors. The author had described her departure as surprising given her trajectory and something of a quiet loss for the sector. 8 years ago, the year she and Adrian got married. He sat back in his chair. The room felt different than it had that morning. Smaller somehow. Like the walls had moved while he wasn't paying attention. He reached for his phone. He put it down. He was not ready to call Dorian at 3 in the morning. He was not ready to tell anyone else about this yet, because telling someone else would require him to organize the shape of what he was feeling, and he was not yet sure he wanted to look at that shape directly. He thought about the dinner. He thought about Simone's voice, low, careful, trying not to disrupt the room, and the way he had stopped her mid-sentence with the laugh. The "you've been away from business too long," delivered to a woman who had apparently been one of the sharpest minds in maritime investment before she became his wife. He thought about how the room had smiled. He thought about how he had not once, in 7 years, looked up her work. He had known she'd been a financial analyst. She had told him he remembered the conversation early in their relationship, when they were still learning each other's professional histories over cheap wine in her apartment. Financial analyst. He'd filed it the way you file the details of a life that isn't yours yet, with interest but without the depth of attention that changes how you see a person. He had never asked what kind of analyst. He had never asked what she'd worked on. He had never, at any point in their marriage, thought to look. It occurred to him, sitting at his desk at 3 in the morning, that he had spent 7 years congratulating himself on marrying a woman who was out of his league, without ever actually investigating what that meant. He opened a new search. He typed Caspian Row Oceanic Current Projects. At dawn, his chief strategist arrived at the office to find Adrian already there. Dorian Pike was 45, efficient, and skilled at reading Adrian's moods in the way that anyone becomes skilled at something they've practiced daily for 6 years. He took one look at his boss and poured himself coffee without speaking. "I need everything you can find on Simone," Adrian said. Dorian didn't react to the name. What kind of everything? Professional history. Before us. Before the marriage. Her work at Row Oceanic specifically. Dorian set down his cup. Adrian. Not what she told me. What's actually in the record? There was a pause. Dorian was good at pauses, the kind that communicated thought without committing to any particular opinion. "I'll have something by noon," he said. He had something by 10. He brought it in a folder actual paper, which Dorian only did when he was preparing Adrian for information he thought might land hard. He set it on the desk and sat across from Adrian and said nothing while Adrian read. Simone had not been a junior analyst. She had been the youngest senior analyst Roe Oceanic had ever promoted to their private coastal investment division. Her assessment modeled the same one vaguely referenced in the annual report. Adrian had found at 3 a.m. had been used to identify 9 properties across the Pacific coast that were subsequently acquired and developed at margins that had made the division's reputation for the following decade. She had turned down 2 competing offers during her tenure at Roe Oceanic. She had been on track by the internal evaluation documents Dorian had somehow obtained for a division leadership role within 3 years of her departure. She departed at 26. Adrian flipped to the next page. The cross-reference was the part that made his chest tighten. Dorian had added notes in the margins in his small, precise handwriting. The warehouse lease that Vail Maritime had secured in its founding year, the one Adrian had spent years, citing as an example of his instinct for undervalued property, had been identified in a feasibility document authored by Simone 18 months before he signed the lease. She had been the one who flagged the property during an informal conversation with a former Roe Oceanics associate who had subsequently introduced Adrian to his first institutional investor. That investor, the one who had appeared at exactly the right moment and whose commitment had legitimized Vail Maritime's first capital raise, was a former Roe Oceanic partner who had remained in loose contact with Simone. Adrian read that line twice. He turned the page. The insurance restructuring during Vail Maritime's second year, the disastrous year when a competitor had undercut them on 2 major contracts and the company had nearly run out of runway, had been resolved through a financing arrangement that, according to Dorian's notes, mirrored almost exactly a model Simone had developed during her Roe Oceanic tenure. Adrian had assumed the financing solution came from his outside consultant. The consultant had been working from a framework Simone had given him, directly in writing. In a document Adrian had never seen because she had handled the communication herself and never led with her involvement, because she'd learned, even that early in their marriage, that leading with her involvement made Adrian uncomfortable. Adrian closed the folder. He sat for a moment. Dorian waited. She tried to tell me about the Harmon acquisition, Adrian said. I know, Section 14. She was right, Dorian said. His voice was careful. I had our legal team recheck last night after you texted me. The cross-default trigger is real. If that acquisition closes as structured, we have a significant exposure problem. Adrian looked out the window toward the harbor. The Sovereign Dawn was gone. Of course it was gone. It had been gone since before midnight. Who else knows she's connected to Roe Oceanic, he asked. As of this morning, half the floor. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. And Caspian Roe? What's he working on currently? Dorian's expression shifted slightly, not quite discomfort, but the professional cousin of it. Something called Blue Meridian. It's been in development for a while. A multi-billion-dollar coastal redevelopment initiative, private marinas, sustainable infrastructure, high-end passenger routes along the Pacific coast. He's announcing it? Preliminary announcement is scheduled for next month. Who's leading it? Dorian looked at him. Adrian already knew. The news broke on a Tuesday. Roe Oceanic announces Blue Meridian Initiative. Simone Mercer named Chief Development Architect. Adrian was in a meeting when his assistant slid a printed article across the table without a word. He read it once, then continued the meeting for another 40 minutes, as if he hadn't read anything at all, which was the kind of performance he had spent years perfecting. After the meeting, he sat alone in his office. The article was thorough. It covered Blue Meridian's scope, the connected marina system, the sustainable infrastructure, the passenger routes. It described Simone's qualifications in a way that made her resume sound inevitable, as if every step had been building toward exactly this. It quoted Caspian Roe, calling her one of the few people in this industry whose vision is genuinely architectural rather than transactional. The photograph was the part that stayed with him. Simone stood beside Caspian Roe on the deck of the Sovereign Dawn. She was wearing a jacket Adrian didn't recognize, something she'd bought after leaving, or something she'd owned before him and never worn during the marriage. She was looking directly at the camera, not performing confidence, not manufacturing authority, just herself. He'd forgotten she looked like that when she was doing something that mattered to her. His first instinct, and he was not proud of this, but it was true, was that she had engineered this to hurt him. That the entire construction of Blue Meridian, the timing of the announcement, the pointed use of her maiden name, was a calculated move designed to damage him publicly by demonstrating how much she was worth outside their marriage. His second instinct, arriving about 40 seconds later, was that this was exactly the kind of thinking that had driven her out the door. He sat with that for a while. Then his pride answered, because pride almost always answers last and loudest. He called Dorian. "We're going to build a competing coastal project," he said. There was a brief pause on Dorian's end. "Adrian, we have relationships with 3 harbor authorities on this coast. We have the capital. We move now before Blue Meridian builds momentum." That's Dorian stopped. Then carefully, "That's a significant pivot from our current strategy. Our current strategy just became Simone Mercer's competition." "So yes," another pause. "I'll put together a proposal," Dorian said. Adrian hung up. He picked up the article again. He looked at the photograph again. He thought about the dinner again, the laugh, the 12 executives, the way the room had smiled on cue. He thought about the folder Dorian had brought him, about warehouse leases and insurance restructuring, and the first institutional investor and all the early days architecture of Vail Maritime that he had spent 7 years claiming as purely his. He thought about Section 14. He had been so certain, so completely, entirely certain. She had been quiet for so long that he had mistaken her silence for agreement. On the Sovereign Dawn, 20 miles out from Port Meridian's harbor, Simone sat across from Caspian Row at a table that occupied the yacht's main salon. Caspian was 62 and looked it in the way that certain people look their age, without appearing diminished by it, the gray at his temples, the deliberate stillness he carried in his shoulders, the quality of his attention that made most people aware of what they were saying before they finished saying it. He had the manners of someone raised with money and the instincts of someone who had understood from a young age that money and power were not the same thing. He had a cup of tea in front of him. He had not touched it. He was watching Simone. She had slept 4 hours. Her coat was folded over the chair beside her. She had her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and was staring at a point somewhere between the table and the horizon beyond the windows, the way people stare when they are not seeing what's in front of them. "You look tired," Caspian said. "I am tired. The different kind of tired this time, I think." She looked at him. He was the only person she knew who could say something like that without it feeling like an intrusion. Possibly because he had known her when she was young enough to still believe that exhaustion was temporary. "You said on the phone you had something to show me," she said. "I do." He slid a portfolio across the table. It was old. The cover was a deep navy blue that had faded at the corners, and the paper inside had the particular texture of documents that have been stored carefully rather than simply stored. She could see through the edge of the cover the distinctive header of her own original letterhead from her Roe Oceanic tenure. She didn't open it immediately. "You kept these," she said. "I kept everything you produced in my division. That's standard practice. You could have destroyed them when I left." "I could have." He picked up his tea. "I didn't." She opened the portfolio. Her own handwriting looked strange to her, now the annotations in the margins, the confidence of the line weights in the diagrams, the particular shorthand she'd developed for asset assessment that she'd never taught anyone else because she'd left before there was anyone to teach. It was like reading a letter from a person she remembered being, but couldn't quite locate in the woman who now sat in this chair. She turned a page, then another. The original Blue Meridian concept, not what Caspian had built it into over the years, but her version, the one she'd sketched out at 25 and presented to him in a conference room, with 3 other people who had looked at her, like she was interesting but probably impractical. Caspian had not looked at her like that. He had looked at her the way he was looking at her now, with the focused attention of someone who knew exactly what they were seeing. "I want you to lead this," he said. "Not the modified version. Your version. What you built." Simone turned another page. "You've been developing this without me. For 8 years," she said. "Developing the framework, not executing it. I've been waiting for you to come back to it." She looked up. "You didn't know I was going to leave him." "No." He set down his tea. "But I knew eventually you would either come back to this work or convince yourself you'd stopped wanting it. And I know you well enough to know that the second option wasn't going to hold." She looked back at the portfolio. There was a sketch on the bottom of the 3rd page, a quick diagram she'd done in a meeting. The kind of thinking on paper she'd done constantly in those years, and had stopped doing somewhere around year 3 of her marriage, when she'd noticed that Adrian's expression when he saw her working meant he thought she was doing something unnecessary. She had stopped carrying notebooks. She had stopped going to the conferences she'd once built her professional network through. She had stopped having opinions about deals in front of people who might take them seriously. None of it had happened in a single moment. It had happened the way everything important happens, incrementally, almost invisibly, until the day you look up and realize you've been somewhere for a very long time that you never consciously chose to be. "I'm not sure I'm still the person who made these," she said. Caspian studied her. "You warned your husband about a structural flaw in his biggest current acquisition," he said. "Correctly, as it happens. He laughed at you in front of 12 people, and 3 days later, you walked out of a penthouse apartment with a small suitcase and boarded my yacht without a single question about where we were headed." Simone said nothing. "You're still her," he said. "You're just out of practice trusting it." She looked at the portfolio for a long moment. Outside, the Pacific coast moved past the windows, all that jagged, underused shoreline. All that potential sitting unrealized, waiting for someone to see it correctly. She turned back to the beginning of her original proposal. She began to read. Back in Port Meridian, the day Simone's Blue Meridian appointment was announced, something else was happening inside Vail Maritime that Adrian was not yet aware of. Dorian Pike made 2 phone calls after leaving Adrian's office. The first was to a number with the Los Angeles area code. The second was to a number that routed through a private exchange Adrian had never had occasion to call. Dorian was efficient and careful and very good at his job. He was also, as it happened, a man who had been working toward a specific outcome for considerably longer than anyone in Adrian's orbit had begun to suspect. The calls lasted a combined 11 minutes. Afterward, Dorian returned to his desk and spent the rest of the afternoon preparing the proposal for Adrian's competing coastal project with meticulous thoroughness, because the most useful thing he could do for the people he was actually working for was keep Adrian moving confidently in the wrong direction. He had been doing this for a while now. He was very good at it. And the one person in Adrian Vail's life who might have noticed the patterns in Dorian's behavior had spent the last 3 days aboard a yacht in the Pacific, reading her own old work and remembering what she was. The Pacific Maritime Summit invitation arrived at Vail Maritime's offices 6 weeks after Simone walked out. Adrian had attended the summit every year for the past 5 years. He was, in the language of these events, a significant figure panel invitations, a breakfast keynote slot, the particular quality of room attention that follows someone who has built something visible and substantial. This year, he almost declined. Not because he feared the optics of attending a major industry event, while his separation from Simone Mercervale was being discussed in the maritime press and the financial press, and apparently in 2 separate lifestyle magazine columns that someone on his communications team had felt it necessary to flag for him. He almost declined because he was tired in a way he didn't entirely understand yet. He accepted anyway. Because Vail Maritime's competing coastal project was underperforming its preliminary benchmarks and needed a public moment of confidence. Because the Harmon Marina acquisition was now officially on hold pending legal review. Because his lenders were asking questions that hadn't been asked before. And because something in Adrian Vail had not yet fully absorbed the information available to it, which was that the problems surrounding him were not the ordinary problems of a business navigating market pressure. They were the specific problems of a man who had silenced the one voice capable of reading what was coming. He arrived at the summit in a car that cost more than most people's annual salary. He walked into the hall with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years becoming comfortable in rooms exactly like this one. He was 10 feet from the entrance when the energy in the room shifted. He felt it before he understood it, a change in the directional attention of 200 people, a collective reorientation, the subtle rearrangement of a crowded space around a new focal point. He turned. Simone walked through the main doors. She wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit he had never seen. Her hair was slightly different, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that she had recently made a deliberate choice about it. She moved with the unhurried steadiness of someone who was not performing ease, but simply experiencing it. Adrian watched 3 separate conversations stop. He watched 2 people he considered significant players move toward her with the body language of people approaching someone they specifically wanted to speak with. He watched an engineer whose opinion he had spent 2 years cultivating laugh at something Simone said and then turned to a colleague with an expression that said, "That's the one to know." He stood at the edge of the room and felt something cold and specific move through him. Not jealousy, not anger, recognition. The slow, nauseating recognition of someone who has been looking at a thing the wrong way for a long time and has finally, in the worst possible setting, seen it correctly. She had always been this. Every dinner she'd attended at his side. Every conversation she'd participated in. Every room full of industry people, where she had stood slightly behind his left shoulder and offered opinions he'd accepted or deflected based entirely on his mood, she had always been capable of this. Of commanding a room. Of drawing the kind of attention that doesn't come from who you're married to. He had not created the circumstances that allowed her to be impressive. He had created the circumstances that prevented it. She turned and saw him across the room. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the moment passed, and she inclined her head in the small professional acknowledgement of two people from the same industry who are no longer in each other's lives, and returned to her conversation. Adrian went to find his first panel of the day. He sat through 90 minutes of discussion about Pacific Coast infrastructure investment and contributed 3 points that were technically sound and entirely hollow, and nobody in the room would have known the difference. And that was its own kind of answer to a question he hadn't quite formed yet. They ended up on the same terrace. It happened the way things happen at industry events, the same instinct toward a quieter space, the same timing, the unfortunate geometry of a building where there was only one terrace, with a view of the harbor. He came out first. He heard the door behind him and turned, and there she was. She stopped when she saw him. Neither of them left. The ocean was audible from here, the low, persistent movement of water against the base of the coastal structure, the harbor lights beginning to come on, as the afternoon slid toward evening. "You look tired," she said. "I'm fine." "I know." She moved to the railing, not toward him, just to the railing, and looked out at the water. That's not the same thing. He thought about leaving. He had prepared, somewhere in the back of his mind, for the possibility of this conversation, had drafted versions of it, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, had imagined himself controlled and precise, and maybe even magnanimous in a way that would demonstrate growth, without requiring him to expose too much of the actual excavation happening inside him. All of that went away. "I know about your work," he said, "before us." She turned her head slightly but didn't look at him directly. "I had Dorian research you," he said, "after you left. I know about your assessment model. I know about the properties. I know about the first investor." Silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. She looked at him then. "I did." He started to respond. She watched him. "Not the Roe-Oceanic connection specifically," she said, "but the ideas, the analysis. I told you about every significant decision I contributed to. I had notebooks. I had documentation I kept, updating for the first 3 years of our marriage before I stopped, because you would take what I said into a meeting 2 weeks later and present it as your own thinking, and then come home and tell me about the conversation, and I couldn't tell if you didn't remember where the idea came from, or if you just didn't think it mattered." Adrian said nothing. "I stopped writing things down," Simone said. "Then I stopped saying them out loud. Then I stopped having them in rooms where you were present." She looked back at the water. "That's how it happens. Not all at once. Just one small accommodation at a time until the accommodations become your whole life." "I didn't know," he said. She turned to look at him. The expression on her face was not contemptuous. It was something more painful than contempt, the particular patience of someone who has moved past the emotion that would have made this easier to dismiss. "I know you didn't," she said. "That was always the problem." He gripped the railing. "Caspian Row offered you Blue Meridian before," he said. "Before us." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "And you turned it down?" "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him for a long time. "Because I was 26 and in love with you and you needed someone and I thought—" She stopped. Something crossed her face. "I thought what I was building with you mattered more than what I was giving up." And for a while it did. For a while what we had was genuinely worth it. He felt the past tense like a physical impact. "And now?" She was quiet for a moment, that stretched until it became the kind of silence that holds a whole answer inside it. "Now I love myself enough not to ask that question anymore." She pushed off the railing. "Simone, I hope the acquisition resolves," she said. It was professional, sincere, the voice of someone who genuinely meant it and had also genuinely left. "I hope you figure it out." She walked back inside. Adrian stood on the terrace with the ocean below him, and the conference continuing through the glass behind him, and something moving in his chest that didn't have a clean name yet. He stayed there for 11 minutes. Then his phone rang. It was Dorian. "You need to come back inside," Dorian said. "Now." The tone in his voice was not Dorian's ordinary professional calm. Adrian turned from the railing. "What happened?" The pause that followed was exactly 1 second longer than it should have been. "The board's been contacted," Dorian said. "There are some concerns about the acquisition." and some questions about another pause, about the capital structure. Adrian was already moving toward the door. Who contacted them? The consortium, Dorian said. The one behind the Harmon network. Adrian pushed through the glass door. The summit conference room was 40 feet away. Through the glass, he could see the faces of his board members already gathered. Could see, from the set of their bodies and the direction of their attention, that something had happened that did not look like it could be contained in an evening phone call. Get in here, Dorian said. We need to manage this now. Adrian walked toward the room. He was 3 steps from the door when something occurred to him. Not a thought, exactly. More an absence where a thought should have been. He had called Dorian before the summit. He had told Dorian about his decision to build a competing coastal project. He had told Dorian what he was planning. And Dorian had known, for 6 weeks, that the Harmon acquisition had a structural problem. And Dorian had not, in 6 weeks, pushed back significantly on the competing coastal project that was diverting resources Adrian needed for exactly this kind of crisis. Adrian stood outside the conference room door. His hand rested on the handle. Inside, his board waited. Outside, somewhere in the building, Simone Mercer, preparing to board Caspian Vro's car back to the harbor. And Adrian Vale, for the first time in 7 years, was not sure that the person he had trusted most was the person he should have been trusting at all. He opened the door. The room went quiet. And the real crisis of his life, the one that had nothing to do with maritime acquisitions, and everything to do with who he had chosen to see, and who he had chosen to ignore, finally, fully, and without any possibility of being laughed off, walked in alongside him. The boardroom had 12 chairs and 9 people, and the empty seats felt like accusations. Adrian walked in and read the room in 4 seconds, the way he always did, not with warmth, but with the specific efficiency of someone who had learned early that reading a room was a survival skill before it was a social one. He saw the 3 board members who wouldn't meet his eyes. He saw the 2 who were watching him too carefully. He saw Dorian standing near the wall with a posture that was almost right, almost the ordinary posture of a chief strategist managing a difficult moment, except for something in the set of his shoulders that Adrian's body registered before his mind could name it. He sat down. Nobody spoke first. That was the first wrong thing. In every difficult conversation Adrian had ever entered, someone spoke first, either him or whoever was leading the charge against him. The silence that greeted him now was not the silence of people gathering themselves. It was the silence of people who had already said what they needed to say to each other and were now waiting to say something specific to him. He put his phone face down on the table. Someone called this meeting, he said, so someone should start it. Margaret Cho, the board's lead independent director, placed a document on the table. She was 61 and had been on the board for 4 years. She had never once, in Adrian's memory, been dramatic. She was the kind of woman who delivered catastrophic information in a tone that suggested she had personally inventoried every alternative and found them all insufficient. That quality which he had always found reassuring now frightened him. We received a communication this afternoon, she said, from a consortium calling itself Pacific Coastal Capital Partners. They alleged that the Harmon Marina acquisition was presented to this board with materially incomplete disclosure of known structural liabilities. Adrian looked at the document. They further alleged that certain advisors within Vale Maritime had knowledge of those liabilities prior to board approval and failed to disclose them. Certain advisors, Adrian said. The allegation is general at this stage. What do they want? Margaret's hands were flat on the table. They've positioned themselves as prospective rescuers. They're offering emergency acquisition financing for the Harmon network at a discount that would effectively transfer controlling interest in the network to them. And they're suggesting that Vale Maritime's current leadership may need to be evaluated in light of the disclosure failures. The room was quiet again. Adrian turned his head slowly and looked at Dorian. Dorian was looking at the table, not at Adrian, not at Margaret. At the surface of the table, with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the table is the most important object in the room. Dorian, Adrian said. Dorian looked up. When did you first have the cross-default covenant flagged? A pause. 1 second, too. The legal team raised it. I'm not asking about the legal team. I'm asking when you personally had it flagged. Another pause. Margaret Cho was watching this exchange with the stillness of someone who already knew the answer to the question being asked and was waiting to see how the person being asked would handle it. 2 weeks before board approval, Dorian said. The temperature in the room changed. One of the board members, Gerald Hurst, 64, the kind of man who wore the same style of watch he'd worn for 20 years because he believed and reliability above display, exhaled through his nose in a way that was not quite a sound, but functioned as one. You had it flagged 2 weeks before board approval, Adrian said. The legal team assessed it as manageable risk within the current debt structure. That isn't what I asked you. Adrian's voice had not risen. That was the thing about Adrian Vale at his most dangerous. He got quieter. He had learned this from a man who ran a shipping yard in Oakland when Adrian was 19 and needed a summer job, and had watched the yard boss dismantle 3 different confrontations without raising his voice once, just by getting more specific and more still, until the other person had nowhere to go. I asked when you had it flagged. You had it 2 weeks before board approval. Did you bring it to me? Dorian's jaw moved slightly. I brought it to the acquisition team. Did you bring it to me? I recommended the legal review, Dorian. Adrian put both hands on the table. Did you bring it to me? Yes or no? The pause this time was long enough that it functioned as an answer all by itself. No, Dorian said. Hurst set down his pen. Margaret made a note on her copy of the document. Adrian sat back. His heart was moving fast. He could feel it in his throat, not panic exactly, but the physical correlate of a realization arriving in full. His mind was assembling something from parts he had not yet consciously examined. The way you assemble a shape in the dark from what your hands find, and the shape coming together was not one he wanted to finish building. He picked up his phone. He turned it over. I need the room, he said. 15 minutes. Margaret looked at him. Adrian. 15 minutes. Then we'll talk about next steps. The board members filed out with the subdued efficiency of people who understood they were being asked to allow something necessary. Margaret was last. At the door, she paused. 14 minutes, she said, and closed it. Dorian didn't move. Adrian looked at him across the empty table. Tell me what you did, Adrian said. Dorian had the face of a man who had prepared for this conversation and was now discovering that the preparation had been insufficient in ways he hadn't anticipated. I managed the acquisition process in the best interest of... Stop. Adrian's voice was flat. I have 14 minutes and I'm not spending them listening to you read from a script you prepared for a different version of this conversation. Tell me what you did. Silence. Then Dorian set his folder on the table. He sat down. The body language was new, not the controlled, forward-leaning posture of a strategist in command of his material, but something that sat differently in the chair, something that had decided the cost of maintaining the performance was no longer worth paying. The consortium identified Harmon as an acquisition target 18 months ago, Dorian said, before you had any interest in it. They needed a buyer with enough market presence to validate the acquisition, drive up the network's profile, and then get caught in the debt structure. The plan was to let the cross-default trigger fire, wait for Vale Maritime to need emergency capital, and move in. Adrian did not move. They approached me 14 months ago, Dorian said. 14 months. Yes, while you were my chief strategist. Yes. And you brought me Harmon. Dorian didn't answer. He didn't need to. Adrian stood up. He walked to the window. The harbor was visible from here a different angle than from his penthouse, lower, closer to the water level. So the boats looked larger, and the horizon looked farther. He stood with his back to Dorian and looked at the harbor. His company, his name on the side of 3 vessels currently in that water. What did they offer you? He asked. Equity in the restructured entity, post-acquisition. How much? Dorian told him. Adrian looked at the harbor for a while. My wife told me about Section 14, he said. At the dinner, she had read the disclosure documents the same afternoon I left them on the kitchen counter. She found the cross-default covenant, and she told me, in front of 12 people, and I laughed at her. Dorian said nothing. You were sitting 3 seats away from her when I did that. Still nothing. You knew she was right, Adrian said. You knew exactly what she'd found, and you sat there and watched me shut her down. Dorian's chair moved slightly, the small sound of a man shifting his weight. The consortium counted on your reaction, Dorian said. Specifically. Adrian turned around. What? Dorian met his eyes for the first time since the board had left the room. Something in his expression had changed, not remorse, exactly, but the complicated affect of a person who has done a clear wrong and has decided that honesty, at this point, costs him less than continued evasion. They profiled you, Dorian said. Before they approached me, they knew that if the structural flaw was raised by someone you'd dismiss it. They identified your wife as the most likely internal source of accurate due diligence because she had the background and the access. They wanted to know if she'd find it. He paused. I told them she probably would. The silence in the room had a different quality now. They factored her into the plan, Adrian said. They factored your response to her into the plan. Adrian stood completely still. In his chest, something was happening that he couldn't entirely categorize, not rage, though rage was present, compressed and radiating heat at the edges of everything else. More primary than rage. The specific horror of seeing at full resolution the shape of what his arrogance had built, and what it had cost, and what it had made him into a man whose dismissiveness toward his own wife had been weaponized against his company by someone sitting across from him at strategy meetings for 14 months. He had given them the weapon. He had handed it to them himself, in a restaurant, in front of 12 people, with a laugh. His phone buzzed. Margaret, texting a single word, time. He looked at Dorian. I'm going to ask you to do something, Adrian said, and you're going to do it. Dorian watched him. You're going to sit outside that door and wait. You're not going to call anyone. You're not going to send anything. You're going to sit in a chair in the hallway of this conference center and wait until I come back out. Because when this board conversation is finished, we're going to have a different conversation. And I need to know where you are when we have it. And if I don't? Adrian picked up his phone. Then I call the Attorney General's Financial Crimes Division with everything I just heard, and you explain the 14-month timeline to them without me in the room to slow things down. He moved toward the door. Sit in the hallway, Dorian. He opened the door. Dorian was in the hallway when the board came back in. The board meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Adrian had never run a board meeting like this one. He had always, in every previous difficult board conversation, come in with a managed position, a version of the facts that was accurate but organized, shaped around a conclusion he had already reached and was guiding them toward. He was good at this. It was one of the actual skills he possessed, distinct from the performance of competence he had come to confuse with competence itself. This time he came in with the truth, not a managed version of it. The actual shape of it, including the parts that made him look like a man who had been maneuvered by someone he trusted, because he had silenced the person who would have caught it. He told the board about Section 14. He told them about Simone's warning and his response to it, and the specific words he had used to dismiss her. He told them what Dorian had just told him, not all of it, not yet, because he needed to protect the thread until he had more of it in hand, but enough. Enough for Margaret Cho's expression to move from its ordinary controlled assessment to something that looked briefly like anger. Enough for Gerald Hurst to put down his pen and not pick it up again for 10 minutes. Enough for the board to understand that what Adrian was describing was not merely a failed acquisition. It was a company culture that had made failure of exactly this kind not just possible but predictable. I built something here, Adrian said near the end, and I told myself for years that I built it alone. I didn't. I had people around me who contributed things I didn't acknowledge, starting with my wife. I created an environment where the most dangerous thing you could do was tell me something I didn't want to hear. And someone on the outside understood that about me, better than I understood it about myself, and they used it. Margaret said nothing for a moment. Then, what are you proposing? Emergency review of the Harmon deal, immediate halt to any financing close. Independent forensic audit of Dorian Pike's external relationships over the last 18 months. A structural review of the acquisition process with board oversight. He paused. And I need the board to authorize me to pursue a private capital solution. Hurst looked up. What private capital solution? Adrian had been thinking about this since the terrace. Since someone had said, I hope the acquisition resolves with the genuine disinterest of someone who had moved past wanting him to fail or succeed and simply existed now in a different space entirely. Since the moment he had realized, standing at that railing, that the only entity in the world that might move fast enough and have the specific maritime expertise to assess Vale Maritime's current situation and act on it before the consortium consolidated their position was Roe Oceanic. I need to make a call, he said. Margaret studied him. To Caspian Row, he said. The room was very quiet. She'll be there, Hurst said. Not cruelly, stating a fact he thought Adrian should have in front of him. I know, Adrian said. And you're still proposing it. I'm proposing it because it's the right solution for this company, not because I'm comfortable with it. He looked at the table. I spent a long time confusing those two things. I'm done with that. Margaret exchanged a look with Hurst that Adrian decided not to try to read. Make your call, she said. Report back by 8 tomorrow morning. He found Dorian exactly where he'd left him. The hallway chair was too low for Dorian's height. He sat with his knees at an awkward angle, his hands on his thighs, his jacket slightly creased in a way that the ordinary Dorian Pike would not have tolerated. He looked up when Adrian came out, and Adrian saw something in his face that was not quite fear and not quite relief, the expression of a man who has been waiting and has had too much time to think about what waiting means. "Walk with me," Adrian said. They walked to the far end of the corridor, away from the boardroom, to a window that looked out over a parking structure. The view was ugly and mundane, and Adrian had chosen it specifically because there was nobody near it. "I need everything," Adrian said. "Every communication with the consortium. Every payment, every equity agreement, every meeting. I need dates, I need names, I need documents." Dorian looked at the parking structure. "Why would I give you that?" "Because the alternative is that this goes to authorities without your cooperation. And a man who cooperates before he's charged has a fundamentally different trajectory than a man who cooperates after." Adrian leaned against the wall. "I'm not a lawyer, but I know enough to know the difference." Dorian was quiet. "There are things in those communications," he said carefully, "that involve other people at Vale Maritime." "Who?" "Not senior, but people who passed information they shouldn't have. Names. 3. 2 of them I don't think knew the full scope of what they were involved in. And the third?" Dorian looked at him. "The third knew enough," he said. Adrian absorbed this. "Give me everything," he said. "Tonight. All of it. I need to be walking into Row Oceanic's offices tomorrow with something that demonstrates the scale of what was done here. Because the only way I keep this company alive is if I can show them that the fraud was external and that I'm actively dismantling it." Dorian was quiet for a moment. "Then what happens to me?" Adrian looked at him. "That's not mine to decide anymore." Dorian turned away from the window. Something passed across his face, complicated, human, the specific expression of a man who had made a series of choices that seemed incremental at the time and is now standing at the accumulated weight of all of them. "I'll have it to you by midnight," he said. He walked back toward the elevators. Adrian watched him go. His hands were steady. That was something he noticed, the specific quality of his own stillness in this moment, which did not feel like calm, but which had the outward shape of it. His heart was still moving fast. He was tired in a way that hadn't arrived yet in his body, but was coming. He could feel it at the edges, the oncoming weight of it. He had not eaten since that morning. He had not slept well in 6 weeks. He took out his phone. He scrolled to a number he had not called in 6 weeks. He looked at it for a long time. Then he called a different number. Caspian Rowe's private assistant answered on the second ring. Simone was in her hotel room when Caspian called. She had changed out of the summit suit and was sitting at the small desk near the window with a glass of water and the Blue Meridian financing schedule spread in front of her, not because she needed to review it tonight, but because working was still the thing she returned to when the day had been too much, when her body was full of something she hadn't finished processing, and her mind needed something concrete to hold. She had thought about the terrace conversation 3 times since leaving it, not obsessively, just 3 times. In the way you return briefly to a thing that made an impression before filing it somewhere appropriate. She thought about Adrian's face when he said, "I know about your work," the particular expression of a man who has discovered something that recontextualizes a significant portion of his own story and is not, yet sure how to live in the recontextualized version. She had seen that expression on his face before, though never about anything this large. She had thought about what it cost him to say it. She had thought about how much it would have cost him more to hear it. Then she had thought about the summit panel she'd sat on that afternoon, and the 3 people who had asked for her card afterward, and the email from the Harbor Authority in Monterey that had come in during the cocktail hour, requesting a meeting to discuss Blue Meridian's Central Coast proposal. She had thought about her own name on the door of an office that was hers. She had stopped thinking about the terrace. When her phone showed Caspian's number, she picked it up on the second ring. "Adrian Vale called," Caspian said. No preamble. It was one of the qualities she had always appreciated about him. He treated time as a finite resource and treated the people he respected as intelligent enough to not need cushioning. Simone set down her water glass. "When?" 20 minutes ago. "Through my assistant. He's requesting a meeting tomorrow morning." A pause. "He didn't ask for you specifically. He asked for Row Oceanic. What does he want?" "Emergency capital and strategic partnership." His words were significant internal fraud and consortium-driven acquisition manipulation. He sounded another pause, and Caspian's pauses were as deliberate as his sentences, like a man who has recently learned something he should have learned earlier. Simone looked out the window. The harbor was dark from here, dotted with the running lights of moored vessels. The Sovereign Dawn was anchored in the outer harbor tonight, a configuration of lights she had memorized in the last 6 weeks without meaning to. "That's Vale Maritime's crisis," she said. "That's not my meeting to be in." "No," Caspian said. "But I want you there, Caspian. Not for his benefit. For ours." His voice was level patient in the way that comes from being right often enough to have earned the patience. If Vale Maritime collapses into that consortium's hands, they control a logistics network that overlaps with Blue Meridian's Central Coast Corridor at 4 points. That's not theoretical. That's a structural problem for our project. Simone knew the 4 points. She had drawn them herself. "So this is strategic," she said. "Everything I do is strategic," Caspian said. "That doesn't make it cold. We can help his company survive and protect Blue Meridian simultaneously. But I want you in that room because you understand both sides of this better than anyone I have." She was quiet. "I'm not asking you to forgive him," Caspian said. "I'm asking you to do your job." She looked at the harbor for a moment longer. "What time is the meeting?" 8:30. "I'll be there." She hung up. She sat at the desk for a while without looking at the financing schedule. She thought about what it would be to walk into a room where Adrian Vale was sitting across from Caspian Rowe. She thought about the specific quality of that, the geography of it, whose side of the table she'd be on, the fact that there was no version of this that didn't require her to be in the same room as her almost ex-husband while being professionally better positioned than him. She thought about whether she was ready for that. She picked up her pen. She went back to the financing schedule. She was as ready as she was going to get. The documents arrived from Dorian at 11:53. Adrian sat at the desk in his hotel room and read through them for 3 hours. They were thorough. That was the thing about Dorian, he was thorough in everything, including the documentation of his own corruption. 18 months of encrypted communications, payment records routed through a consulting LLC Dorian, had set up 22 months ago, meeting notes, internal Vale Maritime assessments that had been altered before reaching Adrian's desk, acquisition due diligence that had been shaped to obscure rather than reveal. And, most damning, a series of messages from 8 weeks before the investor dinner, before Adrian had laughed at Simone, in which the consortium's representative asked Dorian to confirm whether the internal review. Sources had accessed the Harmon disclosure documents. Dorian had confirmed it. He had told them Simone had read the documents. He had told them she had likely found the cross-default trigger. And 3 days before the dinner, the same representative had sent Dorian a message that read, "Maintain current strategy. If she raises it in front of the room, his response will be sufficient." They had not just counted on Adrian, dismissing her. They had arranged the conditions that made dismissal most likely. 12 investors. A public setting. The specific social pressure of a man who spent his life performing authority for an audience. They had engineered the moment. And Dorian had confirmed the location of the bomb and then sat at the table and watched it go off. Adrian closed the laptop. He sat in the quiet hotel room and looked at the wall. He had been sitting with the general outline of his failures for 6 weeks, the folder Dorian had brought him, the photograph of Simone on the deck of the Sovereign Dawn, the terrace conversation and her voice saying, "I told you with a patience that should have been anger, and was myself because of its lack of anger. Worse." He had been sitting with the general outline. Now he had the specific architecture. They had used his dismissiveness like a tool. They had understood the exact mechanism of it, the public setting, the audience, the way his pride operated when it had an audience, and they had set the stage and waited for him to perform exactly the role they'd needed him to play. And he had performed it perfectly. He got up. He went to the window. The harbor was out there somewhere in the dark. Dorian was somewhere in this building. Or he wasn't. Adrian had no way to know whether the decision to cooperate would hold through the night, or whether Dorian's phone was already showing a call to someone who had more to offer than the uncertain mercy of a man whose company was currently burning. He couldn't control that. He could control the morning. He went back to the desk. He opened the laptop. He spent 2 hours organizing the documents into a sequence that told the story cleanly and completely, not for himself, but for a room that would contain Caspian Rowe, who would read them with the rapid, analytical attention of a man who had spent 40 years separating substance from theater. At 3 a.m, he pushed the laptop aside. He thought about calling Simone. He picked up his phone. He looked at her name. He put the phone down. Not because he didn't want to talk to her, because calling her at 3 a.m. to tell her he understood what had happened would still, in some fundamental way, be about his need to be understood rather than her need for anything. He had spent 7 years structuring the communication in their marriage around his needs. He could at least get through the night without doing it again. He lay down on the bed without taking off his shoes. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about the first year. The apartment in Oakland with the water pressure problem, and the neighbor who played music too loudly on Thursday nights, and the kitchen table where Simone had spread due diligence documents at midnight and circled things in red pen and handed them to him with the direct, unguarded intelligence of someone who had not yet learned to doubt whether he'd listen. He had listened then. He had thought then that she was the most interesting person he'd encountered, not because of what she looked like or what she could do for him. Because of the quality of her attention, the way she looked at a problem, like it was genuinely worth solving, without the performance of effort that most people substituted for actual effort. He had fallen in love with her mind. And then, gradually, as the money came, and the company grew, and the rooms got larger, and more full of people who waited for him to speak, he had stopped being interested in what her mind produced. He had stopped listening. And some consortium of people he had never met, who had no interest in his marriage, and no knowledge of his love life, had understood this about him more clearly than he had understood it about himself. That was the part he couldn't yet find the edge of, that the most intimate failure of his life had been visible enough, consistent enough, predictable enough, that strangers had built a financial strategy around it. His phone showed 5:47. He got up. He showered and changed, and was in the hotel lobby by 7:15, 2 documents printed and organized in a folder, a coffee in his hand, his face carrying the specific look of a man who has not slept and does not intend to pretend otherwise. He called for a car. He was at Row Oceanic's regional offices, a quiet building 2 miles from the summit venue, the kind of building that announced nothing from the outside, because the people inside had nothing to announce at 8:10. The assistant showed him to a conference room. He sat down. He placed the folder on the table. At 8:27, the door opened. Caspian Rowe came in first. Adrian stood. They shook hands. Caspian's grip was brief and measured, not aggressive, not warm. The handshake of a man who collected information about people through everything, including how they met his palm. "Mr. Vale," Caspian said. "Thank you for seeing me." Caspian sat. Then the door opened again. Simone came in. She wore a different suit than the previous day, dark blue, structured, the kind of thing that made no visual argument for itself, and therefore made an argument purely through fit and bearing. She carried a slim leather portfolio. She did not look surprised to see him, which meant she'd been told, which meant she'd chosen to come anyway. She sat down across from him, not beside Caspian, across from Adrian, on Row Oceanic's side of the table. He looked at her. "Simone," he said. "Adrian," she said. That was all. It was professional and complete, and contained the entire weight of 6 weeks and 7 years, and a terrace conversation, and a ring on a table beside an untouched whiskey glass. And then it was done, and they were in a business meeting. Caspian opened a folder. "You have 18 minutes before my next call," he said. "So you should start." Adrian opened his folder. He laid the first document on the table. "Dorian Pike has been working against Vale Maritime for 14 months, he said, in coordination with a consortium called Pacific Coastal Capital Partners. Here's the documentation." Caspian picked up the document. He read it. He passed it to Simone without comment. She read it. Her face did not change, but something in her posture shifted, a small, contained shift. The kind that happens when a person reads something they had suspected and finds the suspicion confirmed at a scale larger than they had anticipated. She looked up. "The cross-default trigger in Section 14, she said. "They knew you'd find it," Adrian said. "Dorian confirmed to them that you had read the disclosure documents. They designed the dinner scenario around my likely response to you raising it." Simone was very still. "They used you specifically," Adrian said. "Your access, your background, your ability to find what their documents were designed to hide. And then they used my..." He stopped. "Then, because he had decided that the period of careful wording was over, they used my arrogance toward you as the mechanism. They needed me to shut down the one person who could expose them, and they knew, based on their research, that I would." The room was absolutely quiet. Caspian Rowe had stopped reading. He was looking at Adrian with an expression that was not quite readable, something between assessment and something older, more personal, the expression of a man who has watched a protégé be failed by someone, and is now watching that someone acknowledge it with enough specificity to be believed. Simone looked at the document. She turned to the second page. Adrian watched her read and thought about how many times he had watched her read, across a table and had seen the speed of her comprehension and had, on some level, recognized it as extraordinary and filed it away without ever acting on that recognition. She turned to the third page. She stopped at the consortium's message about the dinner. She read it twice. Then she set the document down. She looked at Caspian. Something moved between them, not speech, not gesture, but the specific communication of two people who have worked together long enough to hold a real conversation in a glance. Caspian inclined his head slightly. Simone looked back at the table. If we don't act in the next 72 hours, Simone said, the consortium consolidates their position in the Harmon network and uses it to establish a logistics corridor that creates direct interference with Blue Meridian's Central Coast infrastructure at 4 critical points. She said this to the table, not to Adrian. I know, Caspian said. Vale Maritime's logistics capacity is operational. The company's assets are sound. The problem is governance and capital, not the underlying business. She turned a page in her own portfolio. If we provide emergency bridge financing under defined conditions, we protect Blue Meridian's corridor, we neutralize the consortium's position, and we establish Vale Maritime as a minority partner in the logistics network we were going to have to build anyway. The board would need to agree to restructured governance, Caspian said. They will, Adrian said. Both of them looked at him. I spoke to Margaret Cho last night, he said. The board is prepared to accept independent oversight and governance reform as conditions of any emergency capital arrangement. They're tired. They want this resolved. Caspian looked at him steadily. And you, he said, what are you prepared to accept? Adrian put his hands flat on the table. Whatever keeps the company alive and makes it something worth keeping alive, he said. I'm not negotiating from pride. I don't have that luxury anymore. Caspian was quiet for a moment. I'll have my team draft the term sheet, he said. You'll have it by 4 this afternoon? He stood. My assistant will see you out. He left. Adrian and Simone were alone at the table. She was gathering her portfolio. Her movements were efficient, contained the movements of someone who had allocated a specific amount of herself to this meeting and was now reclaiming the remainder. Simone said. She paused, didn't look up. I know this isn't the right moment, he said, but I need you to know that I understand what they did. Not just to the company, what they did to you specifically. What I let happen because of how I treated you. She closed her portfolio. She looked up. Her eyes were steady. Not warm, not cold, the specific steadiness of someone who has spent 6 weeks processing grief and arrived, not at resolution, but at a place past the acutest pain of it. I know you understand it, she said. You explained it clearly. That's not, he stopped. I don't mean the explanation. I mean the actual cost of it to you. She looked at him for a moment. No, she said, again, quietly. And there was something in the way she said it that was different from before, not closed, not forgiving, but present. Like she was actually hearing him rather than waiting for him to finish. She picked up her portfolio. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. The term sheet will be fair, she said. Caspian doesn't do punitive. She walked out. Adrian sat at the empty table. He looked at the document spread in front of him, the architecture of his company's near destruction laid out in clean rows. Organized by his own hand, delivered voluntarily to the people he'd spent years positioning himself against. His phone buzzed. Margaret Cho. Dorian and Pike did not check out of the hotel this morning. Security has been notified. The attorneys are ready. Adrian read it. He typed back, I'm on my way. He gathered the documents. He stood. He was 3 steps from the door when his phone rang, not Margaret, not his attorney, not anyone in his contact list. A number he didn't recognize, with an area code he didn't immediately place. He answered it, Mr. Vale. A man's voice, measured, precise, carrying the quality of someone who is not accustomed to making direct calls. My name is Robert Shea. I'm the managing partner of Pacific Coastal Capital Partners. Adrian stopped walking. I understand you've been speaking with Roe Oceanic this morning, Shea said. I wanted to call before the term sheet goes out, because I think there are some things we can offer each other that Mr. Senden, Roe cannot. Adrian's hand tightened around the phone. I want to be very clear about something, he said. Of course, I'm recording this call. A pause. That's your right, Shea said. His voice had not changed. That was the most frightening thing, the absolute steadiness of it, the quality of someone who had anticipated this and remained untroubled. But before you involve counsel, I'd like you to hear one piece of information. Adrian waited. Your wife's original Blue Meridian proposal, Shea said, the one she developed at Roe Oceanic at 25. The intellectual property question around that work is more complicated than either of them have represented to you. Adrian said nothing. We have documentation, Shay said, that could significantly complicate the Blue Meridian project's legal foundation, and Mr. Rowe knows we have it. A pause. I think it's worth a conversation, Mr. Vale. Before you make a decision that closes certain doors. The call was quiet for 1 second. 2. Adrian looked at the door Simone had walked through 6 minutes ago. He thought about what documentation meant in the mouth of a man who had spent 14 months building a trap, using every piece of information available to him. He thought about what it meant that they were calling now, after the Rowe Oceanic meeting, before the term sheet, in the specific window when they could still reshape his decision. He thought about Simone's portfolio, and her voice saying, the term sheet will be fair, and the way she had looked at him for a moment, before walking out, present and complicated and her own. Mr. Shay, Adrian said. Yes? If you have documentation that is material to Blue Meridian's legal standing, you should present it through counsel to the appropriate parties. He moved toward the door. And when you do, my attorney will be present. Along with the recording of this call, he ended it. He pushed through the door into the corridor. He walked fast toward the elevators, his phone already dialing his attorney, the documents under his arm, the recording running, the term sheet 3 hours away, and behind him the conference room where the morning had happened. All of it still carrying the particular temperature of a negotiation that had just crossed the point from which there was no longer any road back to what it had been before. The elevator opened. He stepped in, the doors closed, and in the mirror panel on the elevator wall, for just a moment he caught his own reflection, not the polished, managed version he had spent years presenting to rooms that needed to believe in him, but the actual man, unslept, uncertain, moving forward anyway, with evidence of other people's wrongdoing and acknowledgement of his own, in the same folder, heading toward a reckoning that was going to cost him things he hadn't yet finished counting. The elevator descended, floor by floor toward whatever came next. The attorney answered on the first ring. I need you at the Port Meridian Courthouse in 90 minutes, Adrian said. Bring the fraud documentation template and whatever you need to file an emergency injunction. Against whom? Pacific Coastal Capital Partners. And I need a criminal referral package ready for the AG's Financial Crimes Division by end of day. He pushed through the lobby doors into the morning air. I'll explain everything in the car. Record this call. He was already moving toward the street. His attorney, a woman named Frances Kwan, who had represented Vale Maritime for 4 years and whose defining professional quality was that she never sounded surprised by anything, was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. I'll be there, she said. Adrian flagged a car. He got in, put the folder on his knee, and pulled up the recording from the Shay call. He listened to it again from the beginning, not for content but for texture, for what the pauses revealed, for the specific quality of Shay's steadiness, which was the steadiness of a man who had not been caught off guard because he had not yet been in a situation he couldn't manage. Your wife's original Blue Meridian proposal. The intellectual property question around that work is more complicated than either of them have represented to you. He listened to the line twice. Then he opened his contacts and found a name he hadn't called in 3 years, Marcus Fenn, who had been Vale Maritime's first outside counsel before Francis, before the company had enough money to afford anyone good, a man who knew maritime intellectual property law the way surgeons know anatomy from the inside out. He called. Marcus answered on the 4th ring, sounding like a man interrupted mid-coffee. I need a quick read on something, Adrian said. Maritime IP. If an analyst develops a proprietary investment model, an assessment framework, while employed at a private fund, then leaves that fund, and the fund continues developing a project based on that framework, who owns the underlying intellectual property? A pause on Marcus's end. That's a standard employment contract question. Depends entirely on what she signed when she joined. She left 8 years ago, voluntarily, and the fund kept using the work. The fund spent 8 years building a multi-billion-dollar project on it. Another pause, longer this time. If the employment agreement had a standard IP assignment clause, which every sophisticated fund includes, then the fund owns the work product created during employment. Full stop. Marcus's voice was careful now, the carefulness of a lawyer who senses that the question has more weight than it was presented with. But if the analyst developed any component of the framework before joining the fund, or extended it materially after leaving, there could be a more complicated picture. And if someone else had documentation suggesting that picture was complicated, then they'd have leverage, Marcus said. Real leverage. Depending on the documentation. Adrian looked out the car window. The coast was visible for a moment between buildings, just a strip of gray-blue water, and the outline of the harbor infrastructure that formed the spine of everything he had built, and everything Simone was building, and the specific intersection of both that a consortium of strangers had been quietly mining for 14 months. "Thanks, Marcus," he said. "Adrian." Marcus's voice had changed slightly. "Whatever this is, be careful about how you move in the next 24 hours. Maritime IP litigation involving a project this size doesn't stay contained. It becomes public very fast." He already knew that. He thanked him and hung up. He stared at the folder on his knee. The car hit traffic 2 blocks from the courthouse. Frances Kwan was on the courthouse steps when he arrived, a wheeled case beside her, and 2 associates behind her, carrying the particular expression of junior attorneys who have been summoned urgently and have been told nothing except to bring everything. She looked at Adrian once quickly, with the assessing speed of a doctor doing a field triage. "You haven't slept," she said. "Walk with me." They walked. He told her about the Shea call while they moved through the courthouse lobby. She listened without interrupting, which was her tell. Frances Kwan asked clarifying questions constantly during ordinary conversations. And when she went silent and simply listened, it meant the information was organizing itself into a shape she needed to hold intact before she touched it. When he finished, she was quiet for 4 steps. "They're threatening IP litigation against Blue Meridian," she said, "against the foundation of it, which, if it succeeded, would collapse Caspian Ro's ability to offer you emergency financing, because a project with contested IP at its foundation can't serve as the basis for a legitimate capital arrangement." He held the door for her associates. "It's not about winning the IP case. It's about introducing enough uncertainty to freeze the term sheet." Frances stopped walking. Her 2 associates nearly collided with her. "They don't need to win," she said. "They just need to file. And they probably have documentation they've been sitting on since they started building this play. Something real or real enough to survive a motion to dismiss for long enough to do the damage." Frances looked at him. "When does the term sheet come out?" 4 o'clock. She checked her watch. It was 9:47. "We have 6 hours," she said, "to either neutralize the IP threat entirely or establish that it's insufficient to affect the term sheet's viability." She turned to her associates. "I need every publicly available employment record for Roe Oceanic's Coastal Investment Division going back 15 years. I need the standard IP assignment clause from every Roe Fund agreement you can locate. And I need someone on the phone with Roe Oceanic's general counsel in 20 minutes. She started walking again. "Adrian," she said without turning around, "you should call Caspian Roe before I call his counsel. He should hear this from you first." "I know." He peeled off into an empty conference room. He called Caspian's direct line. It rang 3 times. "Mr. Vale," Caspian said. His voice was exactly what it had been in the meeting room, measured, contained, giving away nothing. "Pacific Coastal Capital Partners called me 40 minutes ago," Adrian said. "After the meeting." Robert Shea, silence. "He indicated they have documentation relating to the intellectual property foundation of Blue Meridian," Adrian said. "Simone's original work." He implied the ownership question was more complicated than represented. The silence on Caspian's end lasted 5 seconds. 5 seconds from Caspian Roe was a long time. "They've had that documentation for 3 years, Caspian said. "I've known about it for 2. Adrian's hand tightened on the phone. "You knew. I knew they had acquired certain records from Simone's original employment file through an intermediary who had access to our archived documentation 12 years ago." Caspian's voice was still level. "Still the same. I have my own counsel's opinion that the IP assignment clause in her original agreement covers the entirety of the framework she developed during her tenure. That opinion has been tested twice in preliminary proceedings and held both times." Preliminary proceedings. There have been 2 prior attempts to threaten Blue Meridian through IP challenges. Neither proceeded past the initial filing. Both were funded by entities connected to the same consortium. A pause. "This is not a new weapon, Mr. Vale. It is the same weapon, deployed a 3rd time at the moment of maximum pressure." Adrian sat down in the empty conference room. He thought about the Shea call, the measured voice. "I think it's worth a conversation, Mr. Vale." They had known about the Roe Oceanic meeting. They had known the term sheet was coming. They had made their call in the specific window after the meeting, before the term sheet, and they had deployed a weapon they'd used twice before, against a man who had no knowledge that it had failed twice before, hoping that his ignorance of the history would make him more susceptible than Caspian had been. "Why didn't you tell me this in the meeting?" Adrian said. Because it wasn't relevant to the meeting, Caspian said. The IP question doesn't affect the term sheet. Our counsel is confident. The challenge, if they file it, will be addressed as the previous two were. Another pause. I told you the term sheet would be out at 4. That remains true. Adrian looked at the empty conference room wall. Mr. Vale, Caspian said. The consortium is doing what cornered entities do. They are creating noise in the hope that you will mistake it for structure. A brief pause. I have dealt with noisier opponents. He hung up. Adrian sat in the empty room for 30 seconds. Then he called Francis. Stand down on the Row Oceanic Council call, he said. The IP threat has been tested before. I'll explain in 5 minutes. He stood up. Focus everything on the criminal referral package. I want Dorian's materials in front of the AG by 2 o'clock. He walked back into the corridor. His stomach was wrong, the hollow, acidic feeling of someone who has not eaten since the previous morning, and has been running on adrenaline and bad coffee, and the particular fuel of a man who has finally, after years of comfortable insulation, been in a situation where he had to think fast or lose everything. He found a vending machine. He bought a granola bar and ate half of it standing in the corridor and threw the rest away. Because his body had forgotten what to do with food, he called his assistant next. I need Margaret Cho briefed on 2 things by 11, he said. The Shea call and Caspian Rose confirmation that the IP threat has been deployed before. She needs to know that before the consortium contacts the board directly, which they will attempt before noon. On it, his assistant said, she was 28 and very good, and Adrian had in the last 6 weeks found himself noticing how many people on his staff were very good and had been allowed to be very good almost despite his management style rather than because of it. He hung up. He went back to Francis. They were 90 minutes into the criminal referral documentation when Adrian's phone showed an unknown number, not the same one as the Shea call, a different area code entirely. He answered it. Mr. Vale. A woman's voice this time, younger than Shea. Precise, my name is Sandra Okafor. I'm calling from the Securities Division of the California Department of Financial Protection. Adrian went still. We've received an emergency complaint this morning alleging material disclosure violations in Vail Maritime's acquisition filings for the Harmon Marina Network. She paused. I'm calling to notify you that we've opened a preliminary inquiry and to request your voluntary cooperation with a document review scheduled for this afternoon. Adrian looked at Francis. Francis had heard the word Securities Division from 6 feet away and was already moving toward him, hand extended for the phone. He held up one finger. Miss Okafor, he said, can I ask who filed the complaint? I'm not able to disclose the complainant at this stage. Was the complaint filed this morning? A pause. Yes. And the scheduled document review, what time are you requesting? 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock. The same time Adrian had scheduled the criminal referral package for the AG's office. He looked at Francis. She was already shaking her head slightly, the small, efficient headshake of a lawyer who has just watched a timeline get deliberately complicated. Ms. Okafor, he said, I want to cooperate fully with your office. My attorney, Francis Kwan, will contact you within the hour to coordinate the specifics. He paused. I also want to make you aware that Vail Maritime is in the process of submitting its own criminal referral to the AG's Financial Crimes Division regarding the same acquisition, specifically regarding conduct by external parties who orchestrated the disclosure issues you've been asked to investigate. Another pause. Longer, I see, she said. Francis Kwan will call your office within the hour, he repeated. Thank you. He hung up. He handed the phone to Francis. She looked at it, then at him. They filed a regulatory complaint against you, she said, this morning, while you were in the Row Oceanic meeting. While I was in the Row Oceanic meeting, he said, and scheduled the inquiry for the same time as your own referral, so that I either miss my 2 o'clock or delay theirs. Francis set the phone on the table. She put both hands flat beside it. They've been running 3 tracks simultaneously, she said. The board contact last night, the Shea call this morning, and this, she looked at him. They prepared all 3 before you walked into Row Oceanic. They knew you were meeting with Caspian. They had contingencies staged. They had someone watching the building, Adrian said, or someone inside it. The room was very quiet. Adrian thought about the Row Oceanic meeting. Caspian Simone himself, 3 people and whatever staff had arranged the room. He thought about Caspian's assistant, who had scheduled the meeting, who had taken Adrian's call the previous evening, who had been the first person outside of Adrian's attorney to know the meeting was happening. He thought about what 14 months of preparation looked like when the endgame finally arrived. Get me in front of the securities division at 2, he said. Don't reschedule the referral. File it at 1:59 if you have to. I want both things on the record before 3 o'clock. Frances nodded once. She pulled out her own phone and began making calls. Adrian stood at the window of the conference room. Outside, the city moved with its ordinary morning momentum cars, pedestrians, the particular indifference of a place that continues regardless of what any individual within it is experiencing. He had always found that quality of cities reassuring. Today it felt like something else. His phone buzzed. A text from Margaret Cho Consortium has contacted 2 board members directly, sharing your communications with Dorian as evidence of your own misconduct, framing you as the architect of the disclosure failure rather than the victim of it. He stared at the text. He typed back, I'm aware. Francis Kwan is handling regulatory. Board should receive my attorney's communication before noon. Do not accept any consortium documentation without counsel present. He sent it. He put the phone in his pocket. He thought about the consortium's framing for a moment, not with outrage, because outrage was a luxury he couldn't currently afford, but with the cold, specific attention of someone trying to understand the architecture of a thing they need to dismantle. They were repositioning him. The disclosure failure was real. That was the foundation of it, the actual solid ground under everything else. They were simply replacing Dorian as the agent of concealment with Adrian, transforming the story from trusted strategist betrays CEO to CEO orchestrates disclosure failure and blames subordinate. It would work on anyone who hadn't seen the documentation. It would create enough confusion in the board, in the regulatory inquiry, in the press to freeze the term sheet, delay the criminal referral, and give the consortium the time they needed to consolidate their position in Harmon before anyone could untangle the competing narratives. Time. Everything they were doing was about buying time. He needed to take time away from them. He went back to Francis. At 12:40, Dorian Pike was located. Not in the hotel, not at the Port Meridian courthouse, where Adrian's attorneys had expected to find him filing a cooperation agreement. Not at any of the 3 addresses connected to the consulting LLC, whose records Adrian had handed to Francis that morning. He was at a private airfield 12 miles east of Port Meridian. He had a bag. He had a car booked to take him to the airfield entrance. He did not have a commercial ticket because the plane waiting for him was not commercial. Adrian found out because Margaret Cho had instructed Vail Maritime Security Director, a former federal investigator named Leon Marsh, who had been with the company for 3 years, and whom Adrian had always found slightly excessive as a hire, and was now actively grateful for to locate Dorian within 6 hours of the board meeting. Leon found him in 4. He called Adrian at 12:41. We can't stop him from boarding, Leon said. Privately chartered aircraft. No violation of any restraining order, because we don't have one yet. No criminal charge filed yet, because your referral is in at 2. Can you delay him? I can have someone at the airfield gate who wants to talk to him about his car reservation, which appears to have been made under a name that isn't his. Adrian thought for 3 seconds. Do that, he said. Get me 20 minutes, he called Francis. Dorian is at a private airfield east of the city, he said. Can you file for an emergency travel restriction? On what grounds? We haven't filed the criminal referral yet. Can you file it simultaneously with the referral at 2? A pause. Francis thinking. If I file both at 1:58, she said, and the referral is immediately assigned to an on-call investigator, which it should be, given the pre-notification we've given, there's a chance the restriction reaches the airfield before the plane departs. Another pause. It's a narrow window. How narrow? 10-15 minutes. Maybe. File at 1:57, he said. He could hear her exhale. Adrian. If this doesn't work and he's already gone, then we work with what we have without him. He stopped walking. But if he's on that plane, whoever is at the other end of his flight has 14 months of documentation about Vail Maritime's internal operations. Everything. Every strategy, every deal structure, every relationship. They'll use it for years. Silence on Francis's end. 1:57, she said. I need to go. She was gone. Adrian put his phone in his pocket. He stood in the corridor of the courthouse. He had 63 minutes. He was in the securities division waiting room at 1:45 when his phone lit up with a number he recognized. Simone. He looked at it for 2 rings, he answered. I heard about the regulatory filing, she said. Her voice was measured, not warm, but present in the specific way it had been on the terrace, actually listening. How Caspian's counsel. A brief pause. They're trying to freeze the term sheet. I know. It won't work, she said. The IP challenge didn't hold. The regulatory complaint will slow things down, but the documentation you submitted through Dorian's records is too specific. They can't reframe the narrative fast enough. The evidence is already in front of the investigators. He thought about asking her how she knew the details of Dorian's documentation. He didn't ask, because he already knew Caspian Rowe did not enter a capital arrangement without understanding the full landscape of what he was entering, and Caspian had people who could access information in the time it took Adrian to go from Rowe Oceanic's conference room to a courthouse. Dorian is trying to leave, he said. A pause on her end. Where? Private airfield east of the city. Frances is filing at 1:57. He could hear her breathing steady, thinking. If he gets out, she said, the consortium has an operational witness they can use to complicate your cooperation claim. They'll put him in front of a camera somewhere outside jurisdiction and let him tell a version of events that makes you the decision maker on the disclosure failures. I know. They've had this as a contingency, she said. Dorian's exit. It's not improvised. He looked at the waiting room. 2 other people with their own folders, their own waiting, their own versions of a morning that had gone differently than planned. Simone, he said. What? He wasn't entirely sure what he'd intended to follow with. The word had come out ahead of the thought. Thank you for calling, he said. A brief pause. The term sheet is still going out at 4, she said. Whatever happens with Dorian. Caspian has already decided. She hung up. He held the phone, 1:53. He put the phone in his pocket. He thought about what Simone had said. It's not improvised. The consortium had planned for Dorian's usefulness ending. They had planned for the moment when Adrian would obtain Dorian's cooperation and the documentation, and they had planned Dorian's exit as a way to simultaneously retrieve their own operational asset and deprive Adrian of his witness, which meant they had also planned for the possibility that Dorian would cooperate, which meant they had known, from somewhere inside Adrian's world, that Dorian's loyalty had a ceiling. His phone lit up at 1:56. Leon Marsh, he's at the gate. Can't hold him past the next 2 minutes. 1:56. Frances was filing at 1:57. He stared at the phone. He texted Leon, keep him 1 more minute. Then he called a number he had not called in 3 years. It rang once. Adrian Vale, said the man who answered. Not a question. Not a greeting. Simply an acknowledgement that the caller was the person whose name had appeared on his screen, delivered with the tone of a man who keeps very careful track of who calls him. Commissioner Aldrin, Adrian said. I need 30 seconds. Thomas Aldrin had been the California Attorney General's Chief of Financial Crimes Enforcement for 11 years. He and Adrian had met at an industry regulatory briefing 4 years earlier and had maintained the kind of professional acquaintance that involved an annual call, a meeting at 1 conference per year, and the mutual understanding that each knew enough about the other's world to be occasionally useful. You have it, Aldrin said. My attorney is filing a criminal referral at 1:57 today. Before she does, you should know that the primary cooperative witness in that referral, a man named Dorian Pike, is currently attempting to board a private aircraft at Eastfield Airfield with documentation that would be material to your investigation. He paused. I thought you should know before the referral arrived. A silence. What airline is this aircraft registered to? Private charter, not commercial. Gate? I don't have a gate number. Eastfield Airfield. He's at the entrance. Silence for 3 seconds. Then I'll make a call. Thank you, Commissioner. He hung up, 1:57. He looked at the waiting room door. He thought about what he had just done. Used a professional relationship with a law enforcement official to flag Fay flight before a formal criminal referral had technically been filed, which occupied a very thin legal and ethical margin that Frances would not have been comfortable with, and which he was going to have to explain to her in detail when this was over. He thought about whether it was the right thing to do. He decided that the category of right things was going to have a complicated week, and that he would sort through it on the other side. At 2:03, his phone showed a text from Leon Marsh. Airfield security requesting documentation. He's not on the plane. Adrian put the phone in his pocket. He looked up. The securities division door had opened. A young man in a gray suit was looking at him. Mr. Vale? We're ready for you. The inquiry lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. Sandra Okafor was thorough, unhurried, and possessed of the particular quality of investigators who understand that the most valuable thing they can do in an initial inquiry is listen more than they speak. She had 3 colleagues with her. She had the consortium's complaint on her desk, which Adrian could see as his peripheral vision, but which she did not reference until the second hour. He answered every question. He answered questions he had not been asked, when the unasked questions were adjacent to something she'd touched and relevant to the shape of what had happened. He laid out the 14 months of Dorian's conduct with the same organized clarity he had brought to the Roe Oceanic meeting, because he had understood since the previous night that the only viable posture available to him was the complete and unmanaged truth, and that this posture was uncomfortable and unfamiliar, and also the only one that gave him any ground to stand on. Francis interrupted twice. The second time was when Okafor referenced the consortiums, framing the repositioning of Adrian as the architect of the disclosure failure, and Francis put a hand on the table and said, with professional precision, "The documentation we've submitted demonstrates a 14-month coordinated scheme to position Mr. Vale as the responsible party for failures deliberately engineered by an outside entity. The documentation is available to your office in full. We'd appreciate the opportunity to walk through it before the complaint framing is given additional weight in this inquiry." Okafor looked at Francis. She nodded. They walked through the documentation. At 4:17, Adrian's phone buzzed with an email from Roe Oceanic's legal team, the term sheet. He read the subject line and put the phone back in his pocket. At 4:42, the inquiry suspended pending further document review. Okafor shook his hand at the door. "Mr. Vale," she said, "I want to be candid with you. The complaint as filed has significant holes in its evidentiary foundation. That doesn't mean the inquiry closes quickly, but it does mean the trajectory of this is likely different from what the filing party intended." He nodded. He and Francis walked to the elevator. In the elevator, Francis exhaled for the first time since morning. "The term sheet," she said. "I saw. I assume you haven't read it." "Not yet. Read it tonight. Call me after." She looked at him sideways. "You should also eat something. You look like a man who's been awake for 36 hours. 32. Remarkable," she said flatly. The elevator reached the lobby. He walked out into the late afternoon. The city had shifted into the particular light that came in early evening on the California coast, gold and horizontal. The kind of light that made everything look slightly more significant than it probably was. He stood on the courthouse steps with his folder and his phone, and the hollowed-out body of a man who had spent a full day doing things he had never done before. His phone showed a text from Margaret Cho. "Board has reviewed the Roe Oceanic term sheet. Emergency session called for 7 tonight. Your presence is required." He texted back, "I'll be there." Then a call from a number he didn't recognize, different from this morning's unknown numbers. He answered with the wariness of someone who had learned, in the last 12 hours, that unknown numbers arrived with structural complications. "Adrian Vale," said a voice. Male. Older. Slightly hoarse in the way of people who have spent decades in rooms with bad acoustics. "This is Gerald Hurst," the voice said. Hurst, the board member. The one who had put down his pen and not picked it up for 10 minutes during the boardroom confrontation. "Gerald," Adrian said. "I'm not calling as a board member right now," Hurst said. "I'm calling as someone who has known you for 4 years and has spent today watching the sequence of events unfold with some attention." A pause. "I want to tell you something before the 7 o'clock meeting." Adrian sat down on the courthouse steps. 2 people walked around him without looking at him. "Dorian Pike contacted me this morning," Hurst said. Adrian went very still. "Before the airfield," Hurst said. "Before the regulatory filing. He called me at 9:15 and told me that the documentation you had presented to the board came from a source he described as compromised, and that you had selectively organized it to obscure your own role in the acquisition failures." Adrian said nothing. "He sent me a document," Hurst said. 3 pages. "An internal Vale Maritime Strategy memo from 11 months ago bearing your name. It detailed the acquisition of the Harmon network as a vehicle for a debt restructuring play that would, and this is a quote, generate short-term capital gains, regardless of the network's long-term viability." Adrian's jaw was tight. "I've never written a memo with that language," he said. Hurst said, "I know you're writing. That memo has 3 phrases in it that you would not use. I spotted them in the first read." A pause. "But I'm 64 years old, and I've sat on enough boards to know my reaction is not universal. 2 of the other members received the same document, and they don't know your writing as well as I do." The light was still doing its evening thing, gold, horizontal, significant. Adrian looked at it. "They fabricated a memo," he said, "with your name on it, your role and title. Your company letterhead," Hurst said, "dated 11 months ago when the acquisition process was in its early stages." A pause. "It's good work. Not perfect, but good enough to create a problem for you tonight. If the 2 members who received it decide it merits discussion before the term sheet vote." Adrian closed his eyes briefly. He opened them. Who are the two members? Hurst told him. He knew both of them, knew them in the specific way. You know people you have managed carefully for years, without necessarily understanding them. One of them was a man named Peter Calloway, who had always been the most likely to follow the room rather than his own judgment. The other was a woman named Diane Lau, who had been appointed to the board 18 months ago. 18 months, which meant she'd arrived during the window of Dorian's consortium relationship, and whose appointment Adrian had supported because Dorian had recommended her. He thought about that for a moment. He thought about what 18 months of a planted board member looked like when the endgame finally arrived. Gerald, he said, yes. Can I ask why you're calling me? A pause. Because I've watched a lot of men in your position spend a crisis protecting their pride instead of their company, Hurst said. And in the last 24 hours, you've done the opposite. I thought that deserved something. Another pause. I'll see you at 7. He hung up. Adrian sat on the courthouse steps. The folder was on his knee. The term sheet was in his inbox. The board meeting was in 2 hours and 12 minutes, and somewhere in the building behind him, Dorian's documentation was working its way through the regulatory system. And somewhere across the city, Dorian himself was not on a plane, but was also not in police custody yet, which meant he was somewhere between those two states and making decisions about which direction to move. And a fabricated memo with his name on it was sitting in 2 board members' inboxes. He picked up his phone. He called Frances. I need you at the Vale Maritime boardroom at 6:45, he said. Not 7. 6:45. What happened? He told her. She was quiet for 3 seconds. A fabricated document, she said, with my name and letterhead. Dated 11 months ago. They've had this prepared. They've had everything prepared, he said. For a long time, Adrian. Her voice had changed slightly a register. He had only heard from her once before, during a contract dispute 2 years ago that had nearly become an international arbitration. The register of someone who is assembling the full picture and does not entirely like the shape of what it makes. If the 2 board members who received this document vote against the term sheet at 7, the Roe Oceanic arrangement fails. I know. And if it fails, the consortium's regulatory complaint and whatever documentation they continue to introduce makes your position at Vale Maritime untenable by next week. I know. So the entire thing, everything we've done today, the referral, the inquiry, Dorian at the airfield, it comes down to 2 board members and a fabricated memo. Silence. 6:45, she said. 6:45. He hung up. He stood up from the courthouse steps. He stood there for a moment, with the evening light on his face, the weight of the folder in his hand, the quiet and specific understanding of a man who has just seen the full architecture of a thing designed to destroy him, how many months it took to build, how many pieces it had, how each piece had been placed to reinforce the others, and how the central weight-bearing element of the entire structure had been from the beginning a single character flaw that he had spent years refusing to examine. His dismissiveness, his need to be the loudest intelligence in the room, the laugh at the investor dinner. They had built 12 months of sophisticated financial fraud on the foundation of one bad moment, because they had understood that the moment was not an aberration, but a pattern, and that a pattern was a load-bearing wall you could build against. He had given them the wall. He walked down the courthouse steps. He had 2 hours. He started walking toward Vale Maritime's offices, because some things you needed to do on your own 2 feet, without a car, with the physical weight of the distance between where you were and where you needed to be pressing into the soles of your shoes. He needed to think. He needed to think more clearly and more honestly than he had thought about anything in years, because the next 2 hours were going to require him to walk into a boardroom and ask 2 people who had received a document designed to destroy their trust in him to set that document aside and vote for something that required them to trust him. And he had no argument for that, except the truth, not the organized, managed, strategically presented version of it, but the actual shape of it, including the parts that made him look exactly like the man the fabricated memo described. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A text from a number he didn't have in his contacts, but which he recognized from the call records Frances had pulled that morning as one of the consortium's secondary communication lines. The text was 3 words. Walk away, Vale. He read it. He put his phone in his pocket. He kept walking. The city moved around him in the evening light, indifferent and enormous, and Adrian Vale walked through the middle of it with a fabricated document in 2 inboxes, and a board meeting in 109 minutes and 7 years of accumulated arrogance pressing down on every step, And he did not stop, because stopping was the one thing that was no longer an option he could afford to take. He walked 42 blocks. He knew it was 42, because he counted them without meaning, to the specific involuntary counting of a man whose mind needed something concrete to grip, while the rest of it worked through things that didn't have clean edges. The evening had gone darker by the time he reached Vale Maritime's building. The harbor was lit now, the working lights of the marina reflecting off water that moved with the particular agitation of a coast expecting weather. There was a storm system building somewhere offshore. He had read it in a 2-line notification on his phone that he'd dismissed without looking at properly. He stopped in front of the building. He looked up at it. His name was not on the exterior. He had made that choice deliberately when they moved in, because he had told himself he wanted Vale Maritime to be bigger than any single person, which he now recognized as a decision that had been about ego rather than philosophy. The specific ego of a man who wants to be known as the kind of person who doesn't need their name on the building. He went inside. His assistant was still there. She was at her desk, with 3 screens open and a notepad covered in handwriting beside her keyboard. And when she saw him, she stood up in the way that people stand up when they've been waiting for something and the thing has finally arrived. "Frances called," she said. "She's downstairs." Peter Calloway arrived early. He's been in the small conference room for 20 minutes. Diane Lau is in the lobby. "Who's with Calloway?" "Nobody." He came alone. A pause. He asked for water. "That's all." Adrian looked at his assistant, really looked at her, the way he had not been looking at people for years, with the actual attention of someone who sees a person rather than a function. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." She looked slightly surprised. Then she nodded. He went downstairs. Frances was in the lobby with her wheeled case, and the expression of someone who has been running hard all day and has decided to run a little further because the alternative is stopping. "Tell me about the memo," he said. "I've had a digital forensics contact looking at it for 40 minutes, she said, her voice low and fast. "The document metadata shows creation in a Vale Maritime template file. The problem is the template version. The file properties show a template revision that Vale Maritime updated 14 months ago, but the memo is dated 11 months ago. If the memo was created 11 months ago using that template, the file properties should show the earlier template version." Adrian looked at her. "They used the wrong version. By 3 months. It's not obvious unless you know what to look for." She pulled a single printed sheet from her case. "This is the forensic note. 2 paragraphs. Enough for a board member to understand that the document's internal dating is inconsistent with its claimed creation date." He took the sheet. He read it. It was clear. Not technical. Frances had clearly told the forensics contact to write for a non-expert reader, which was the right call, which was why Frances was worth every dollar he had ever paid her. "This is enough," he said. "It's enough to introduce reasonable doubt about the document's authenticity. It won't exonerate you tonight, but it's enough to make 2 careful people pause before they vote against you on its basis." He folded the sheet. He put it in his jacket pocket. "Calloway first," he said. Frances nodded. He went to the small conference room. Peter Calloway was 61, heavy through the shoulders, with a face that had the particular weathered quality of a man who had spent decades outdoors before moving indoors into boardrooms, and who still carried the outdoor version of himself in how he took up space. He was sitting with his hands folded on the table and a glass of water in front of him. He looked up when Adrian came in. He did not stand. Adrian sat down across from him, no folder, no paper. Just the 2 of them, and the table and the water glass and the specific quality of a room where a difficult conversation has been waiting to start. "You got the document," Adrian said. "This morning. From Dorian." "Yes." Adrian looked at him. "Have you read everything I submitted to the board?" "I read it last night." "And the document Dorian sent?" "This morning." "Yes. Which one do you believe?" Calloway looked at him for a moment. His hands unfolded and refolded. "That's a harder question than it probably sounds." "I know it is. Because the document Dorian sent has your letterhead, your title, your formatting." Calloway's voice was measured, not hostile, but carrying the weight of a man who has been sitting with something comfortable for 8 hours and has not yet found a way to put it down. "And because some of what's in it matches things I already believed about how this acquisition moved forward." "What things?" "The speed, the enthusiasm, the way you shut down questions during the April presentation." Calloway looked at the table. "You pushed that deal, Adrian, hard. And when people raised concerns, you redirected them. I was in those meetings." Adrian said nothing. So when a document arrives that says the pushing was deliberate, that you knew the debt structure had problems and intended to use them, Calloway stopped. I'm telling you this because I've known you 4 years, and I think you deserve to know what's actually in my head, rather than a cleaned-up version of it. I appreciate that, Adrian said. He took the forensic sheet from his pocket. He put it on the table. He slid it toward Calloway without comment. Calloway looked at it. He picked it up. He read it once, then again more slowly. He set it down. The template version, he said. 3 months wrong. Calloway looked at the sheet for another moment. Then he looked at Adrian. That's not nothing. No, but it's also not proof. No, Adrian said, it's not. What I can tell you is that the document describes a strategy that would have required me to knowingly expose this company's capital structure to a triggered debt event, while simultaneously being aware of the crossed default covenant, which means it. Requires me to have read Section 14, understood it, and built a plan around it. He leaned forward slightly. Peter. At the investor dinner 3 nights before my wife left, she told me about Section 14, in front of 12 people, and I told her she'd been away from business too long. Calloway was very still. If I had read Section 14, Adrian said, I would not have laughed at my wife for finding it. The room was quiet. Calloway looked at the forensic sheet. He looked at Adrian. He picked up his water glass and put it down without drinking. I need to think, he said. 7 o'clock, Adrian said. He stood up. That's all the time there is. He left. He found Diane Lau in the lobby, standing with the careful composure of someone who is not sure how long they will be required to maintain it. She was 44, precise in her presentation, and had always conducted herself in board settings with a professional neutrality that Adrian had found appropriate, and now, standing in front of her, found slightly opaque in a way he wished he had examined earlier. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and he thought about what Gerald Hurst had told him, that Dorian had recommended her appointment 18 months ago during the window. And he thought about what that meant and didn't mean, because being recommended by a corrupt person did not automatically make you complicit in the corruption, and because assuming the worst of everyone in his vicinity had been a luxury he could no longer afford. I know about the document, he said. I assumed you would. Do you want to talk before the meeting? She considered him for a moment. No, she said. Her voice was even. I want to hear what you say in the boardroom. He nodded. That's fair, he said. He went to find Francis. The boardroom at 7 held 9 people and a storm building outside the windows. Adrian could hear it, beginning not thunder yet, just the change in air pressure that preceded weather on this coast, the way the silence got a different texture, the way the building seemed to settle slightly deeper into itself. Margaret Cho opened the meeting. She presented the Roe Oceanic term sheet in 4 minutes, the structure of it, the capital amount, the governance conditions, the minority logistics partnership, the board composition changes required. She did this without editorializing, without indicating whether she supported or opposed it, with the neutral precision of a person who believed that the board's job was to decide, and her job was to ensure they decided with full information. And she looked at Adrian. Mr. Vale the floor. He stood up. He did not have notes. He had not written anything down in the car. He had tried, in his head, to organize what he needed to say, and everything he organized had sounded managed, had sounded like the carefully shaped version of truth that he had spent 7 years delivering in rooms exactly like this one. And he had decided, standing outside the building looking up at his name that wasn't on it, that he was done with that particular skill. The fabricated memo, he said first. He put the forensic sheet on the table and sent a copy to each board member's tablet. Simultaneously, Francis had prepared the distribution while he was talking to Calloway and Lau. He gave them 30 seconds to look at it. The document Dorian sent this morning has internal metadata inconsistent with its claimed creation date, he said. My attorney has the full forensic analysis. This copy summarizes the core discrepancy. I'm not asking you to accept that as conclusive exoneration. I'm asking you to factor it into how much weight you give that document tonight. He paused. He looked at the table. What I'm about to say doesn't have a forensic report, he said. It's just the truth. And I've gotten very bad at delivering truth without organizing it first, so I'm going to try doing it the other way. Nobody moved. I drove this acquisition, he said, not because of the strategy in the fabricated memo, because I wanted it. Because it was big and it was visible, and because I had spent 6 years building something that was genuinely good, and had started to confuse the fact that it was good with the idea that my instincts about it were always right. He looked at Gerald Hurst. My wife found the cross-default trigger. She found it the afternoon. I left the documents on the kitchen counter. Because that's what she does. That's what she has always done. And she told me about it at a dinner in front of 12 people, and I laughed at her. Not because I was certain she was wrong. Because the room was full and she was inconvenient, and I had spent so many years being right that being wrong in public had become the thing I feared more than actually being wrong. The room was completely quiet. Outside, the first real sound of the weather, not wind yet, but the suggestion of it, a low pressure moving through the building's exterior. Dorian Pike was in the room when I laughed at her, Adrian said. He had known about the cross-default covenant for 2 weeks. He had told the consortium that my wife would find it. He had told them what my response would be. He paused. He was right about my response. That's the part I can't move past. He had profiled me accurately. He understood that my arrogance toward the person who was trying to protect this company was a reliable mechanism, and he used it. Peter Calloway's hands were flat on the table. Diane Lau was looking at something past Adrian's shoulder, not avoiding, but the particular focus of someone who is taking in a lot of information and directing it inward. I can't undo the culture I built here, Adrian said, where pushing back on me had costs and agreeing with me had rewards, and where the person most capable of honest assessment of this company's decisions was sleeping in the same house as me and had learned to stop raising her hand. He exhaled. What I can do is accept these conditions. Every governance condition in the term sheet. Independent board oversight, restructured leadership, Blue Meridian partnership as a minority logistics contributor. Because they are the right conditions for a company that needs to become something better than what I made it. And because I am not the person who should be making that argument from a position of unilateral control. He sat down. The room was quiet. For 11 seconds he counted those two. Then Margaret Cho said, discussion. What followed was 40 minutes that Adrian experienced in segments, not as continuous flow, but as a series of distinct moments that his exhausted, underslept mind could only hold individually. Gerald Hurst speaking first, calmly, about the forensic inconsistency in the fabricated memo and his own reading of the documentation Adrian had submitted. Peter Calloway listening to Hurst, hands still flat on the table, not speaking. Diane Lau asking 2 questions, both of them precise, both of them directed at the governance conditions rather than at Adrian's conduct, which told him something about where her concern actually lived. A board member named Raymond Cross, who had said almost nothing in Adrian's memory of him, saying that he had read the Roe Oceanic term sheet 3 times and believed the governance conditions were aggressive but appropriate given the circumstances. Francis sitting behind Adrian, not speaking, present in the way that good attorneys are present, not performing, not signaling, just available. And then Peter Calloway, who had been quiet for 37 minutes, looking up from the table. I want to say something, Calloway said. Everyone looked at him. I've been on 6 boards, Calloway said, in 28 years. And I've watched a lot of men in your position. He looked at Adrian, decide that the thing to do in a crisis is to protect the story they've been telling about themselves, to manage what comes out and when and to who. He paused. What you just did is not that. I don't know if it means you've changed. I don't know what it means past tonight, but it's not that. He looked at Margaret. I'm voting for the term sheet. Diane Lau looked at Calloway. She looked at Adrian. So am I, she said. The vote was 7-1. Raymond Cross voted against, which Adrian suspected had less to do with the substance of the term sheet and more to do with Raymond Cross's conviction, held since the day Adrian had vote-ridden him on a staffing decision 3 years ago, that Adrian Vale was temperamentally unsuited to operating within constraints. Raymond Cross might not be entirely wrong, but he was also not the majority. Margaret Cho announced the result. She did not celebrate it. That was not her way. She simply stated it, noted the date and time in the minutes, and asked whether there was additional business. There was not. The board began filing out. Adrian sat at the table. Frances came around and sat beside him. She put her case on the floor. She said nothing for a moment. 7-1, she said. 7-1. She looked at him. You know this isn't over. I know. The regulatory inquiry is open. Dorian is in the wind pending the travel restriction. The consortium will continue to contest Frances. He looked at her. I know. She closed her mouth. She looked at the window. The storm had arrived properly now, rain against the glass. The sound of it filling the room. Go home, she said. Sleep. Be back here at 8 tomorrow. He nodded. He stayed at the table after she left. He sat in the empty boardroom with the rain against the windows and his hands on the table and the weight of the day pressing down through his shoulders into the chair, and he sat there for a while, because moving felt like something he needed to be ready for. His phone buzzed. Caspian Row. Received board confirmation of the term sheet acceptance. My team will begin the capital transfer process tomorrow morning. Welcome to Blue Meridian, Mr. Vale. Short professional. Containing, if you knew how to read Caspian Row, a small set of something that was not warmth exactly, but was the closest Caspian got to it in a business context. Adrian read it. He typed back, "Thank you." He put the phone down. He thought about Simone. He did not call her. He knew the call he wanted to make, the one that would tell her about the vote, that would let him hear her reaction, that would give him the specific comfort of her voice, in a moment when everything had just been decided. And the outcome was something other than catastrophe. He wanted that call. He recognized the wanting of it clearly. He also recognized that wanting it was exactly why he should not make it. He stood up. He was at the boardroom door when his phone rang. Leon Marsh. "What?" Adrian said. "Dorian Pike just walked into the Port Meridian field office of the FBI," Leon said. "He asked to speak with an agent. He's been there for 40 minutes. Adrian held the door frame. "Voluntarily," he said. "Voluntarily. No attorney that anyone observed." He walked in off the street. Adrian thought about the travel restriction, about the airfield, about the 3 hours that had passed since the restriction had presumably reached Dorian, somewhere between the gate and the aircraft. 3 hours was a long time to sit with 14 months of a decision you had made and its accumulated weight. "All right," Adrian said. "That's it? All right. What do you want me to say, Leon?" A pause. "I don't know. I guess I expected something more dramatic from you." "I'm tired," Adrian said. He ended the call. He walked to the elevator. The lobby of Vale Maritime was quiet. The security desk had one person on it. The lights were on the evening setting, lower, warmer, the after-hours version of a building that ran on the energy of people who were no longer in it. He pushed through the front doors. The rain hit him immediately. He hadn't brought an umbrella. He hadn't thought about an umbrella at any point in the last 17 hours, because umbrella was the kind of thought that existed in the ordinary metabolism of a day. And today had not been an ordinary day's metabolism. He stood in the rain outside his building and looked at the harbor. He could see the shape of the Sovereign Dawn's lights, from here the configuration he had memorized on the outer harbor. He stood in the rain for a minute. Then he started walking to where he'd arranged a car, 3 blocks south, and he was halfway there when his phone rang again, with a number he recognized this time. Robert Shea. He stopped walking. He looked at the name. He answered. "Mr. Shea." The rain was loud enough that he had to press the phone harder against his ear. "Your board voted," Shea said. "Yes." 7-1. Yes, pause. The particular pause of a man recalculating in real time. "That's disappointing." "I imagine it is, Mr. Vale." The voice had changed, not losing its steadiness exactly, but something in the temperature of it had shifted. The measured quality was still there, but underneath it something had tightened. "What you've done tonight is not the end of this. You have a regulatory inquiry open. You have an acquisition structure that is going to take months to unwind at significant cost. You have a company that now operates under external governance conditions it has never operated under before. And you have an ex-wife whose intellectual property you are now in business partnership with, which will create complications you have not yet anticipated." Adrian stood in the rain. "I'm telling you this," she said, not as a threat, as an assessment. "Because I want you to understand that what happened tonight doesn't resolve the underlying conditions. It only changes the immediate timeline." "Mr. Shea," Adrian said. "Yes." "Why are you calling me?" A pause. "Because I've been doing this for a long time," Shea said, "and men like you usually break earlier. I wanted to understand why you didn't." Adrian thought about that. "I'll tell you," he said. "The woman you factored into your plan, the one whose access to the documents you had confirmed, whose ability to find the cross-default covenant you relied on, whose relationship with me you used as a mechanism." He paused. "She didn't save me tonight. I want to be clear about that. She was not in that boardroom. She did not intervene. She told me the term sheet was fair, and then she let me find out whether I was capable of earning it." He wiped rain off his face with the back of his hand. "That's why I didn't break. Because, for the first time in 7 years, there was no version of this where someone else was going to fix it. And I found out that when that's the situation, you either become the person who can handle it, or you don't." Shea was quiet. "That's more honest than I expected," he said. "It's been a long day for honesty," Adrian said. He ended the call. He stood in the rain for 3 more seconds. Then he kept walking. He slept 5 hours. It was more than he had expected, and less than he needed, and when he woke at 5:47, His body felt like something that had been compressed for a long period and had not yet fully returned to its original dimensions. He showered. He made coffee with the hotel room's inadequate machine and drank it standing at the window, watching the post-harbor, which was calmer now, the specific stillness of a body of water that has been worked over by weather and is recovering. He called Frances at 6:15. "Dorian is cooperating," she said. No greeting. She'd been up for a while. Fully, apparently. The FBI field office contacted the AG's financial crimes team at 2 in the morning. It's moving fast. How fast? 2 of the consortium's principals are already under travel restrictions. Shay is one of them. Adrian thought about the call in the rain. "There's something else," Frances said. Her voice had a quality he recognized, the quality of someone who has information they know, changes the picture, and is organizing how to present it. "Tell me." Diane Lau came forward this morning, before 8. She went to the FBI field office. He sat down on the edge of the bed. "She was approached by the consortium 14 months ago," Frances said, "when Dorian recommended her for the board appointment. They asked her to provide internal Vale maritime communications relevant to the acquisition process. She declined. She said she told them directly that she was not going to do it, but she didn't report the approach at the time because she wasn't sure what reporting it would accomplish and because she had no documentation of the contact. She voted for the term sheet," Adrian said. "She voted for the term sheet, and then she went home, and then at 1 in the morning she called the FBI because she had sat with the white of the unreported contact for 14 months, and the vote had apparently been the thing that resolved her decision about what to do with it." Frances paused. She told them about the approach. She gave them everything she remembered, including a name that corroborates Dorian's account of the consortium's structure. Adrian was quiet. "She wasn't dirty," he said. "No. She was scared." "That's different." Another pause. "Adrian, this morning's development changes the regulatory picture significantly. With Dorian cooperating, and Lau corroborating the consortium's board-targeting approach, the complaint against you is going to look like what it is within the next 48 hours. The inquiry may still run its course, but the direction of it has changed." He looked at the harbor through the window. "I'm coming in at 8, he said. "I'll be there." He hung up. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. He thought about Diane Lau at 1 in the morning, making the call she had not made for 14 months, deciding that the weight of the unreported thing was finally heavier than the risk of reporting it. He thought about the specific courage of that, not dramatic courage, not the courage of someone who had nothing to lose, but the difficult, ordinary courage of a person who had been carrying something alone and finally put it down in the right place. He picked up his phone. He opened a message to Simone. He typed, "The board voted 7-1. Term sheet accepted. Dorian is cooperating with the FBI. I thought you should know." He looked at it. He deleted the last sentence. He sent, "The board voted 7-1. Term sheet accepted. Dorian is cooperating with the FBI." He put the phone in his pocket and finished his coffee. At 7:42, walking toward the Vale Maritime building in the post-storm morning, his phone buzzed. "Simone, I know," Caspian told me. "I'm glad." 2 words at the end. "I'm glad." Not "I'm glad for you." Not "I'm glad for the company." Just "I'm glad" without an object, without specifying what the gladness was directed at, which left it open in a way that his exhausted and complicated heart did not quite know what to do with. He texted back, "Thank you." He put the phone away. He kept walking. The harbor was visible from the street, now the full sweep of it in the morning light. The Blue Meridian preliminary infrastructure on the south end, the Vale Maritime dock structures on the north, the boats moving through the water between them. He looked at it and thought about how many times he had looked at this harbor from his penthouse balcony and seen it as the evidence of what he had built, and how rarely he had looked at it and seen it as what it actually was, which was a piece of the world that a lot of people had shaped over a long time, and that he had been allowed to be part of for a while, and that would outlast him, and the shape he had tried to press into it. He reached the building. He stopped. He looked up. Then he went inside. Frances was at the conference table with 4 attorneys and 2 accountants, and a screen full of documentation that had arrived from the FBI's overnight processing of Dorian's cooperative statement. And the morning moved into the intricate, grinding work of dismantling 14 months of a conspiracy that had been built carefully and would have to be taken apart with equal care. They worked through breakfast. They worked through lunch. At 2:47, Frances's phone rang. She answered, listened for 11 seconds, and said, "Hold on." She looked at Adrian. "Robert Shea was taken into federal custody this morning," she said. 2 additional consortium principals are in custody in Los Angeles. The travel restriction held overnight on 4 more individuals. She paused. The AG's office is calling this a coordinated securities fraud and market manipulation scheme with an operational period of not less than 18 months. Adrian looked at the table. What about the Harmon Network, he said. Frozen pending the criminal investigation. The consortium's financing arrangement is void, which means the network reverts to its pre-acquisition status. Francis set down the phone, which means Vail Maritime's acquisition is technically still live, pending resolution of the debt structure issues, which we now have capital to address, he said. From Roe Oceanic. Correct. He sat back. He thought about Section 14, the cross-default trigger. The covenant buried in 340 pages of documents that Simone had found in an afternoon, and he had laughed at. He thought about how different everything might have been if he had said, at that dinner table, "Tell me what you found." 3 words. Tell me what you found. The specific cheapness of what it would have cost him, and the specific enormity of what it would have saved. Adrian. Francis's voice was careful. There's one more thing. He looked at her. She slid a document across the table. This came through the forensic review of Dorian's communications, she said, toward the bottom of the consortium's operational planning files. He picked it up. It was a risk assessment document. Consortium letterhead or what passed for letterhead in a shell company operation. Dated 16 months ago. He read the heading. Contingency assessment, subject spousal relationship. He read it. It took 4 minutes. When he finished, he set it down. He put both hands flat on the table. The document was a formal assessment. The consortium had commissioned a risk analysis of the variables in their plan. And one of those variables was the spousal relationship between Adrian Vail and Simone Mercer Vail. The analyst had assessed the risk that Simone would find the disclosure issues in the Harmon documents. The analyst had also assessed the risk that, if the plan failed, Simone would be positioned to assist Adrian in the recovery. The final section of the document was titled Mitigation. The mitigation strategy for the spousal variable was described in 2 parts. The first was what they'd executed leveraging Adrian's dismissiveness to ensure Simone's findings were shut down. The second was what they had held in reserve. If the first mitigation failed, or if the marital relationship deteriorated in ways that positioned Simone as an independent actor rather than a spousal asset, the consortium had prepared documentation designed to implicate Simone in the original Harmon acquisition false records, suggesting she had been aware of the debt structure problems and had withheld that information to protect a competing investment position. They had prepared a version of the fabricated evidence designed for Simone, not deployed yet. Not deployed because the first mitigation had worked perfectly, had worked so well that Simone had walked out of the marriage before they needed to execute the contingency. But it was there, in the files ready. Francis was watching him. They had a contingency for her, he said, yes, if she had stayed, if she had kept fighting for the company, if she had become more visible as a defender of Vail Maritime rather than someone who had left. They would have shifted to the second strategy, Francis said. The fabricated records implicating her. She paused. Adrian. She's not currently at risk. The documentation was never deployed, and with the consortium principals in custody, there's no one to deploy it. But she needs to know it existed. He looked at the document. He thought about Simone on the terrace. I love myself enough to leave. He thought about the night she had walked down to the dock, and the captain had said, "Welcome back, Ms." Mercer and she had stepped aboard without looking up. He thought about how many ways this consortium had been willing to use her. He thought about the fact that the accident of her leaving the decision that had broken his pride and undone his certainty and started the unwinding of everything he had assumed was solid had been the thing that protected her from the contingency they'd prepared. She had saved herself by leaving, not him, herself. I'll tell her, he said. I can have counsel. No, I'll tell her. He stood up. She should hear it from me. Francis looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. He picked up the document. He walked to the window. The harbor was still there, always the harbor, always the water, always the particular, light that changed with the time of day and the weather and the season, but kept returning, kept being the harbor, kept existing outside of everything any individual person in any building overlooking it was going through. He looked at it for a moment. Then he called Simone. It rang 4 times. He thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she picked up. Adrian. Her voice was neutral, not cold, not warm. The voice of someone who has placed this at a professional distance and is maintaining it. I need to see you, he said. today, in person. There's something in Dorian's documentation that involves you specifically, and you need to know about it. He paused. It's not bad news about the company. It's about what they had prepared in case things went differently. A pause on her end. How long? 20 minutes. 30 if you have questions. Another pause. I'm on the Sovereign Dawn, she said. Dock 3. He looked at the harbor. He could see Dock 3 from the window. I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said. He put the document in his jacket pocket. He looked at Francis. Keep going without me, he said. I'll be back within the hour. He walked out of the conference room and down the corridor and into the elevator and through the lobby and out into the afternoon. And the harbor was right there, the way it was always right there, and Dock 3 was 200 yards south. And the Sovereign Dawn was exactly where Simone had said it was, enormous and black and silver and impossible seeming in the afternoon light. He walked toward it. He was 100 yards away when he saw her at the rail. She saw him at the same moment. Neither of them waved. He kept walking. She kept watching. And the document in his jacket pocket, the consortium's clinical assessment of how to use and then destroy the woman he had spent years slowly failing, pressed against his ribs with every step, the weight of it specific and sharp, like something that had been there for a long time and had only now become possible to feel. He reached the dock. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. Come up, she said. He walked up the gangway, and the document was in his pocket, and the afternoon light was doing the thing it did on this coast. And somewhere behind him in a federal field office, 14 months of carefully engineered destruction was being dismantled piece by piece, and none of it, none of the votes or the referrals or the term sheets or the regulatory inquiries, none of it was the hardest thing he was going to do today. The hardest thing was the next 20 minutes. He stepped aboard. The deck of the Sovereign Dawn was teak and wide and slightly damp from the previous night's storm, and it smelled of salt water and the particular mineral cleanness of a vessel that had been well maintained for a long time by people who understood that a ship's condition was a form of honesty. Simone led him to the stern, not inside. Outside, which told him something that she had decided whatever this conversation was going to be, she wanted open air around it, wanted the horizon in her peripheral vision, wanted the option of looking at something other than a room's four walls while she heard whatever he had come to say. She stood with her back to the rail and her arms loose at her sides. She had been working before he called he could see it in the slight distraction still present in her eyes, the residue of a problem she'd been turning over that had not yet been fully set down. She was in a dark sweater and trousers, no jacket, which meant she hadn't planned to be outside this long, and had come up from below when she saw him walking toward the dock. She looked at him and waited. He took the document from his jacket pocket. He held it out to her. She took it. She read it. He watched her face while she read it. Not intrusively, he looked at her, the way you look at someone you have known, long enough to read the small signals, the micro-adjustments that happen in a face when information is arriving and being processed. He watched the line of her jaw. He watched her eyes move across the page. He watched the moment, roughly 90 seconds in, when she reached the second mitigation section, and her reading slowed not because she was struggling with the language, but because her mind was doing what it always did, which was build the full structure of a thing before moving past it. She read to the end. She lowered the document. She looked at the harbor. He waited. They had a version for me, she said. Yes, if I had stayed. If you had become visible enough as a defender of the company. If the first strategy failed. He paused. They were prepared to reposition you as complicit in the disclosure failure. Fabricated records showing you had known about the debt structure and withheld it to protect a competing investment position. Simone looked at the document again, not reading it a second time. Just looking at it, the physical object of it, the paper and the ink and the clinical language of people who had sat in a room and discussed how to destroy her as a risk mitigation exercise. My leaving protected me, she said yes. Not because I knew about this. She said it flatly, not as a question. I left because I needed to leave. And the leaving happened to put me outside the range of what they had prepared. Yes. She set the document on the rail beside her. She looked at the water. He let the silence run, because the silence was doing something, was giving her room to locate herself in the full picture of what she had just read, and interrupting that process with words would be the old instinct, the Adrian Vale, who had spent years filling silences, because silence felt like a vacancy where his authority should be. He stood quietly. The harbor moved. How long before they had this prepared, she said. 16 months ago, based on the document date. 16 months, she let that sit. We were still married. Yes. She turned and looked at him directly for the first time since he had come aboard. "You came here to tell me this yourself," she said. "Francis offered to have counsel present for it." I said no. "Why?" He thought about how to answer that in a way that was true and not shaped into something more flattering than the truth. "Because they used you," he said, "from the beginning. They used your access, your ability to read those documents, your relationship with me. They used the specific way I treated you as a mechanism. And then they had a contingency for using you more directly if the first approach failed." He looked at her. "You deserve to hear that from me, not from a lawyer in a conference room." Simone looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the water. "I'm not going to fall apart," she said, "if that's what you're worried about. I know, I read it, I understand what it means. She stopped. She exhaled through her nose, not a sigh, something shorter, the controlled release of someone managing the physical response to information that has landed harder than they intended to show. "I'm angry. I'll be angry about it for a while. But I'm not going to fall apart. I didn't think you would." She picked up the document again. She looked at the consortium's letterhead. "Caspian will want to see this," she said. "I made a copy before I came. Francis has it." She nodded. She set the document down. She turned around and looked at the harbor over the rail, her back to him, her hands on the rail, her shoulders carrying the specific set of someone who is in the middle of something and is deciding how much of the middle to show. And he stood behind her and to the left, not close, not at a distance that meant anything except that he was present and not pressing. 7 years, she said. Not to him specifically, to the harbor. He didn't answer. For 7 years, I told myself the problem was specific things. The dinner, the credit, the way he answered for me in rooms. She stopped. But the real problem was that I stopped trusting my own reading of a situation, because the person I lived with kept revising my readings until I didn't trust them anymore. She paused. And then strangers built a financial crime around the gap between who I was and who he had gradually told me I was, which is she stopped again. That's a specific kind of damage. He stood very still. "I'm not saying that to hurt you," she said. "I know. I'm saying it because I need to say it out loud to someone who was there. Someone who understands what the specific thing was." She turned around. "You're the only person who was there for all of it. That doesn't mean I want to be near you. It just means sometimes you're the only person who has the full context." He looked at her. "I understand," he said. And he did. That was the part he had not expected, how completely and uncomplicatedly he understood it. Not as a rebuke, as a fact. The specific limited truth of it, she needed to say the real thing out loud, and the only person who had the full context to receive it was him, and that was a complicated and finite kind of need that had nothing to do with reconciliation or forgiveness or any of the stories he had spent 6 weeks half writing in his head during the sleepless hours. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted, not softening exactly, but changing in the way that a person's face changes when they have been braced against something and the thing has not hit where they expected. "You're different," she said. "I don't know that yet," he said. "I know the last few days have required me to be different. I don't know whether that's the same thing." She considered that. "That's honest," she said. "I'm working on honest." A small thing happened at the corner of her mouth, not a smile, but the possibility of one, brief and gone. She reached down and picked up the document. She held it out to him. He took it. Their hands did not touch. They were careful, both of them, in the way that people are careful when they understand that the stakes of a gesture have changed. "Thank you for coming," she said, "for telling me yourself." "Of course. You should go," she said. "You have a lot left to do." He did. He had Francis and the accountants and the regulatory timeline and the Harmon network unwinding and months of work ahead of him that he was not yet capable of fully envisioning because he was still in the middle of the current day. He turned toward the gangway. "Adrian." He stopped. He turned back. She was looking at him with the specific attention she had always had, the quality of it that he had fallen in love with 20 years ago at a table covered in contracts, the ability to look at something as if it was genuinely worth seeing. "What you said in the boardroom," she said. "What Gerald Hurst told me you said." He waited. "About not understanding how much strength it took to stay." She paused. "I don't know if you understand it now, but the fact that you finally named it," she stopped. "It's not nothing." He held that. He did not try to build on it, did not try to use it as a foundation for something else. He took it as what it was, a precise and limited acknowledgement, offered carefully by someone who no longer had any obligation to offer him anything. "Thank you," he said. He walked down the gangway. He did not look back. The months that followed were the hardest work Adrian Vale had ever done, and they were hard in a way that was different from every previous difficulty of his professional life. Harder not because the problems were larger, but because solving them required him to continuously override the instincts that had made him successful and replace them with instincts he was still learning to trust. The independent board oversight arrived with 3 new directors appointed by Roe Oceanic, and they were thorough, and they asked questions in meetings that Adrian had to learn to answer without redirecting, and there were weeks in the early months where he went home to a smaller apartment in a quieter part of Port Meridian and sat with the particular discomfort of a man who has spent his life being the loudest competence in the room and is learning what it feels like to be one competence among several. He learned it, not gracefully, not without moments where his old instincts rose up with their familiar authority and had to be put down again like something trained rather than something tamed, but he learned it. Dorian Pike's cooperation with federal investigators was thorough and damaging to the consortium's remaining principals. 4 of them were indicted within the first 60 days. Robert Shea's case was the most complex. His attorneys were good, and the shell company architecture was deliberately labyrinthine. But the combination of Dorian's testimony, Diane Lau's corroborating account, and the forensic trail from Vail Maritime's own documents built a case that Francis described as the kind that gets taught in business school for the wrong reasons. Dorian himself took a plea arrangement that involved significant financial penalties and a prohibition from serving in any advisory capacity to a publicly registered entity for 15 years. Adrian was not in the courtroom when the arrangement was entered. He had thought about going. He had decided that whatever he needed from that moment, it wasn't something a courtroom could give him. The Harmon Marina network was resolved over 4 months of negotiations that involved 3 sets of attorneys, 2 mediators, and 1 emergency weekend session in a conference room that smelled of bad coffee and carpet cleaner. The cross-default covenant was restructured. The liability was contained. The network became a modest but functional component of Blue Meridian's Central Coast Logistics Corridor, which meant that Simone's original warning about it had been in the strange, circuitous way of things not just vindicated, but transformed into a foundation. He did not mention that to her. She already knew. The Blue Meridian opening ceremony was held on a Tuesday in late spring. Adrian arrived early and stood at the edge of the public waterfront space, watching the setup crews run through their final positions. The flagship harbor was extraordinary, not in the way that things built to impress were extraordinary, with their scale and their visible expense, but in the way that things built with genuine thought were extraordinary. The solar-roofed terminals had been designed to look like they belonged to the coastline, rather than having been imposed on it. The public waterfront was genuinely public open benches, accessible pathways, a children's area near the tidal pools that he had noticed when he walked in and had stopped beside for a moment, watching 2 small kids argue about a sea anemone. He had built shipping infrastructure for 15 years and had never once built anything that a child might stop and argue about. He thought about that. He went and found a spot near the back of the assembled crowd where he could see without being particularly visible, because this was Simone's day, and the specific way he could honor that was by not making it also about him. She spoke for 12 minutes. He had heard Simone speak in professional contexts dozens of times over the years at investor dinners, at the few conferences she'd attended during their marriage, at the board meetings early in Vail Maritime's life, when she had still been an active voice in the room. He had always known in the abstract that she was good at it. Standing in the back of a crowd of 400 people watching them watch her, he understood for the first time that good at it had been a significant understatement. She spoke about the coastline as if it were something alive, not sentimentally, not with the performed passion of someone who has learned to perform passion, but with the specific, grounded intelligence of someone who had spent years thinking about what this particular stretch of coast needed and had found in that thinking. Something that looked like love for the thing itself. She spoke about the 15-year-old version of Blue Meridian, the one she had sketched at 25 in a conference room with 3 skeptical colleagues, and she did it without bitterness and without the performance of triumph, which was its own kind of courage.